Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into a tale that will curl your spine and keep you on the edge of your seat. This one's not for the faint of heart, so you've been warned. If you've heard of Amityville before, you already know what kind of darkness it holds. The house, the horrors, the history. And tonight, we're about to take you through it piece by piece. You're about to hear the chilling story of the house that never lets go. And if you're brave enough to stick with me, well, you might just make it to the end of this journey. But then again, you probably won't survive this one. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue had always been a quiet, unassuming place on the surface. A suburban home on Long Island, nestled among neatly manicured lawns and carefully paved streets. From the outside, there was nothing to suggest the horrors it contained within. It stood like so many other homes, quiet, innocent, hidden behind the usual veil of everyday life. But inside, the air was thick with something that felt off. Something ancient. Something dark. George Lutz, a man in his early 40s, had moved his young family into the house just a few months earlier. He was a man of practicality, someone who didn't put much stock into stories of the supernatural. But when his wife Kathy had found the house at a reasonable price, he'd been eager to make it their new home. It was perfect for their 3 children. Quiet, spacious, the kind of place that promised a fresh start. Little did he know that fresh start would quickly turn into a descent into madness. It didn't take long for George to start noticing strange things happening in the house. At first it was small, easy to ignore. Cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. The occasional creak of the floorboards in the middle of the night, though no one was awake. A fleeting shadow in the corner of his eye. But then the events began to escalate, and there was no denying something was terribly wrong. The house had a way of sucking the joy from the people who lived in it. George and Kathy noticed a shift in their behavior, their moods darkening for reasons they couldn't explain. George, who had always been a calm and collected man, began to experience violent mood swings. Kathy, once full of life, found herself inexplicably exhausted, her energy drained by something unseen. And the children? They too were affected, though they couldn't quite articulate what they were feeling. The oppressive weight of the house pressed on them, slowly breaking them down. Kathy's youngest daughter, Missy, seemed to be the most sensitive to the house's energy. She would often speak to an imaginary friend she called Jody. At first, Kathy dismissed it as the innocent imaginings of a young child. But the way Missy would describe Jody, his glowing red eyes, his unsettling presence, soon made Kathy question whether her daughter was simply playing pretend. But it wasn't just Missy's strange conversations that raised alarms. There were other things too. The room at the back of the house, the one with the small, narrow window, once a sunroom, was now the source of unsettling noises, scratching sounds that came from within the walls as if something or someone was trapped inside. The house groaned and shifted at odd hours of the night as if it had a life of its own, a heartbeat deep within the foundation. One night, as Kathy stood in the kitchen, her eyes darted to the clock. It was nearly 3:15 a.m., the time when the house seemed to be at its worst, the time when the presence in the house was strongest. And then it started. The temperature dropped. The air grew thick and clammy, as if something was suffocating the space. Kathy's breath caught in her throat as a shadow moved swiftly across the room, disappearing around the corner. She froze, unable to move, feeling the cold creeping under her skin. The silence that followed was suffocating until finally a loud crash from upstairs broke the stillness. George rushed up the stairs, and when Kathy followed him, She found him standing in the hallway, staring down at the once innocuous room that had now become the epicenter of their terror. The door, which had always been tightly shut, was now wide open. Inside, the air was thick, and Kathy could see nothing but the faint glow of a light bulb hanging above them. It flickered and buzzed with a constant rhythmic hum. "George, we have to leave," Kathy said, her voice barely more than a whisper filled with dread. She didn't need to say more. He knew it too. The house was not their home anymore. Something had taken root there, something old, ancient, and powerful, and they couldn't escape it. But the decision wasn't so simple. The house had begun to own them, drawing them back no matter how hard they tried to leave. Every time they tried to pack up and leave, the house would send them back. Objects would go missing. Voices would whisper through the walls, and something would always pull them back. Their love for one another grew distant, their thoughts clouded. George began to feel something dark inside him, a force that was urging him to stay, urging him to fight whatever it was that had latched onto his family. It wasn't just the house that had changed them. Something had infected them, twisted their thoughts, their desires. They felt the pull of it, a need to uncover more, to understand what was happening. They wanted answers. But the more they sought, the more the house demanded from them. It was a dangerous game they were playing, and the stakes were higher than they could ever have imagined. The house had always been alive in its own way, but now it was awake. It had found its next victims, and it wouldn't stop until it had them. And as the days dragged on, as George and Kathy tried desperately to protect their children, they realized something far more terrifying. The house wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, and it knew them. It was feeding off their fear, growing stronger every day. The house had been waiting for them, waiting for a family to move in, to fall under its spell, waiting for them to give in to the darkness it held within. And as the sun sank beneath the horizon on another cold evening, Lucy and Betsy realized that the worst was yet to come. The night that followed the unsettling discovery of the open room was filled with an uneasy silence. The family, already strained from the eerie happenings within the house, could feel the weight of something sinister lurking just beyond their awareness. George, though clearly troubled by the events, had managed to maintain some semblance of control until now. The house was no longer just a structure. It was a force that had begun to seep into every corner of their lives, every decision they made. By morning, the tension was palpable. Lucy felt it in her chest, a constant tightness that wouldn't loosen no matter how deeply she breathed. She couldn't even remember the last time she had felt calm. Betsy, always so perceptive, had begun to retreat into herself, speaking little. Her once vibrant eyes now clouded with something she couldn't explain. Every time Kathy tried to speak to her, she would talk about Jody, that imaginary friend who had somehow taken on a life of its own in the most disturbing of ways. "I saw him last night, Mom," Missy whispered one evening, her small voice trembling. "He says he's waiting for you, for all of us." The words struck Kathy like a physical blow. Her daughter had always been imaginative, but there was a difference now, something darker, something that had shifted deep within her. She couldn't help but feel that the more Missy spoke of Jody, the more present that unseen figure became in the house. And with every mention, the house seemed to respond, shifting, groaning, moving in ways that made it seem almost alive, aware of their every move. George, still fighting his internal battles, began to spend more time outside, pacing the yard, like a man trying to outrun his thoughts. But no matter how far he walked, the house was always there, watching, waiting. And at night, when the moon hung high above, it would call him back. There was no escaping its grasp. One night, as Kathy sat alone in the living room, her hands trembling as she sipped from a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She felt the air shift. The room seemed to darken the shadows, stretching unnaturally long. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs, loud, deliberate. But George was outside. The kids were asleep. Slowly, her feet moved on their own accord, as if the house was pulling her, guiding her. She stood at the foot of the staircase, staring up into the dark hallway that led to the children's rooms. The house groaned, its walls creaking, the lights flickering, like they were on the verge of giving up. Then she saw it. At the top of the stairs stood a figure. Pale, distorted its eyes, glowing with an unsettling intensity. It wasn't quite human, but it was unmistakably there, a presence that was neither of this world nor the next. The figure stepped forward, and Kathy's heart skipped a beat. "Mom," a voice whispered, but it wasn't hers. It wasn't even George's. It was the voice of the house, deep, heavy, filled with malice. Before she could move, the figure lunged forward, disappearing into the dark hallway with a deafening screech. Kathy screamed, her voice lost in the chaos of what she had just witnessed. She ran upstairs, her mind racing, hoping against hope that she hadn't seen what she thought she had. When she reached the children's rooms, she found them still in their beds. Missy, the youngest, was asleep, with her back turned to the window, her face peaceful. The soft sound of her breathing filled the room, but Kathy couldn't help but feel the deep, eerie presence still hanging in the air. Her heart was pounding, and her hands shook as she reached out to check on each child, to make sure they were safe. Suddenly, a deep voice echoed from somewhere within the walls, a low guttural growl vibrating through the very foundation of the house. "You cannot leave. You belong to me." Kathy stumbled back. Her breath caught in her throat. The words were clear, like a knife cutting through her, and they came from the house itself. The walls, the floor, the very air. The voice continued whispering its demands into her mind, urging her to give in. It was the house, the force that had been quietly growing stronger ever since they moved in. It had been watching them, studying them, waiting for them to fall under its influence. Outside, George had finally returned to the house, his brow furrowed in concern as he entered through the back door. He had heard the sounds of Kathy's scream and rushed inside, only to find her standing at the foot of the stairs, her eyes wide with terror. Kathy George's voice was barely a whisper as he reached for her. "What happened?" She turned to him, the fear evident in her eyes. But there was something else there too, a realization. She understood now. This house wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a structure of wood and brick. It was alive in a way they had never imagined. It fed off their fear, their confusion, and it was only getting stronger. "They've done it," Kathy whispered, barely able to speak the words. "They've claimed us." The words hung between them like a death sentence. There was no denying it now. The house had chosen them, and just like the darkness that lived within it, the house wouldn't let them go. "We have to leave," Kathy said, her voice shaky but urgent. "We have to get out of here." But George, despite everything he had witnessed, still hesitated. He had felt the pull of the house too, but he couldn't admit it to himself. He couldn't bring himself to believe that they were truly trapped. "Leave," he echoed, disbelief in his voice. "We can't just leave. This is our home, Kathy." Kathy's heart sank. The house wasn't just pulling on George. It was pulling on him too. She could see it in his eyes. The same shadows, the same strange compulsion that had begun to creep into her own heart. The house wasn't just their home, it was their prison. With every passing hour, the house grew stronger, its grip tightening. It had chosen them, and now it would never let go. The air seemed to thicken with each passing moment, until even breathing felt like a struggle. Shadows began to lengthen, creeping into corners of the house that had never seemed so dark before. The pressure in the air became unbearable, and the house's whispers grew louder. They had no choice. They had to fight back somehow, but it was already too late. The house had won. The weight of the house's malevolent grip pressed heavily on George and Kathy. The walls seemed to close in around them, each room a mirror of the others filled with shadows, echoes of sounds that couldn't be traced, and whispers that seemed to seep from every corner. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a living thing, a beast that fed on fear, on confusion, on broken spirits. And now George and Kathy's spirits were beginning to unravel under its weight. That night, the house seemed to come alive in a way it hadn't before. Every creak of the floorboards was like a voice calling them into the dark, into the unknown. Kathy found herself awake at 3:15 a.m., the cursed hour, the time when everything seemed to happen. The wind howled outside, but the house inside was eerily still, as though it was waiting for something. Kathy lay there in bed, her body stiff with tension, listening to the distant hum of the house. Somewhere in the walls, something was moving. She couldn't sleep. From the corner of her eye, she saw it, a figure standing at the foot of the bed. She jerked upright, but the figure was gone in an instant, like a shadow retreating back into the darkness. But she could still feel it, its presence, as if it were watching her. Her heart raced, her breath shallow as she strained to hear. The silence felt oppressive, pressing against her chest. Kathy slowly turned to George, hoping to find some comfort in his presence. But he wasn't there. The bed was cold, as though he hadn't been there in hours. Panic started to rise within her, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. She got up, her feet moving on their own accord, driven by a need to find him, to make sure he was okay. "George," she whispered, her voice trembling as she crept through the dark house. She walked down the hallway, her footsteps soft but heavy in the silence, her mind racing with every possible worst-case scenario. She reached the staircase and looked up. The hallway above was dark, the shadows deepening at the edges, twisting in unnatural shapes. She heard something from upstairs, a thud, followed by a dragging sound. Slowly, cautiously, Kathy ascended the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. "George," she called again, louder this time. There was no answer. The house seemed to swallow her voice. As she reached the top, the temperature dropped sharply. The chill wasn't natural. It was as if the very air was alive, pulling the warmth out of her body. She reached the end of the hallway where the children's rooms were, and her breath caught in her throat. The door to Missy's room was wide open. Inside, the faint glow of a nightlight illuminated the empty bed, the room in complete silence. Kathy's heart skipped. She could feel the presence now thick and suffocating. She stepped into the room, her eyes darting around, searching for some sign of what had happened. And then she saw it. The window was wide open. Missy was gone. Her pulse quickened. The wind outside whipped through the trees, rattling the windows. Panic surged through Kathy's veins as she rushed to the window, peering out into the dark night. She could see nothing, just the shadows of the trees bending under the force of the wind. Her breath fogged the glass as she frantically looked around, hoping to see her daughter somewhere in the yard. "Missy," Kathy shouted, her voice cracking with fear. A faint sound reached her ears, an almost inaudible giggle, high-pitched and eerie, floating on the wind. Kathy froze. She knew that laugh. It was Missy's, but it sounded wrong. Twisted. "Jody," Kathy whispered the name of the imaginary friend that had become something far more sinister in recent days. The sound of the giggle continued, growing louder, closer. Kathy turned quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was still empty, but the air was alive with a presence that she could no longer ignore. She ran out of the room and into the hallway, her footsteps frantic. She found George standing at the end of the hall, his back to her. His body was stiff, his hands at his sides, his head tilted slightly as if he were listening to something. George, Kathy gasped, rushing toward him, but when she reached him, she stopped short. His eyes were empty, vacant. He didn't turn to look at her. He didn't speak. George, Kathy's voice wavered as she placed a hand on his shoulder. He finally turned, but his face was not his own. His features were twisted like a mask, contorted in a grimace that sent a wave of cold fear through her. His mouth stretched unnaturally wide, but when he spoke, it wasn't his voice. It was deep and guttural, like the voice of something else entirely, something that had taken control of him. "You cannot leave," the voice rasped. "You belong to me." Kathy stumbled back, her heart racing as the words sank into her skin like ice. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. She was frozen, trapped in the nightmare that had become their home. "George, please," she whispered, her voice full of terror. "Please fight it. Fight whatever this is." But George's eyes, vacant and hollow, stared at her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. And then, without another word, he turned away and began to walk down the hallway, his movements slow and deliberate. Kathy felt herself following, unable to stop. It was as if her feet were moving on their own, as though the house itself was pulling her forward, guiding her deeper into its grip. She had no choice but to follow him. They walked down the long corridor to the back of the house, to the room they had once avoided, the room where the darkest energy seemed to gather. The door was open now, as if waiting for them. Kathy could feel it. This was the place where everything had started. The shadows gathered in the corners, twisting and writhing like living things, the air thick with the smell of something rotten, something ancient. And there in the center of the room was Missy, but she wasn't the sweet, innocent girl she had been before. She stood in the middle of the room, her eyes glowing an unnatural shade of red, her mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. The room hummed with energy, a dark, oppressive force that made it impossible to breathe. "Mom," Missy said, her voice distorted, "we've been waiting for you." The darkness had won. The words hit Kathy like a slap to the face. She stood frozen, her body locked in terror, as she looked at Missy. The child she once knew, the girl who would laugh and play, was now something else entirely. Something unrecognizable. Something twisted by the very house that had claimed them all. "Missy," Kathy whispered, her voice trembling. But the word felt hollow, like a desperate plea from the depths of her own fear. She reached out her hands, shaking as she moved closer to her daughter, her heart pounding in her chest. But Missy did not respond, as she had before. Her eyes, glowing red and full of an otherworldly hunger, tracked Kathy's every movement. The smile on her face twisted into something unsettling, a grin that wasn't a sign of joy, but of something far darker. "You can't save me," Mom, Missy said again. But this time, the voice was not her own. It was something deeper, more malevolent. It was the voice of the house, the thing that had been whispering in the corners of their minds, the thing that had been drawing them in one piece at a time. "Missy," Kathy cried, her voice breaking, "please come back to me." But Missy's face remained unmoved. Her body didn't flinch, didn't stir. She was rooted in place like a puppet on strings, controlled by the force that had overtaken the house. The shadows in the room seemed to move in response to Kathy's words, rippling and shifting as though they had minds of their own, closing in tighter around her. A cold breeze swept through the room, carrying with it a low, guttural whisper. Kathy's breath caught in her throat as the house itself seemed to speak, its voice rising from the walls, the floor, the very air she breathed. "You have failed it," said the voice, dark and mocking. "You cannot fight what is already inside you. The darkness has claimed your family. It will claim you too in time." Kathy stepped backward, her heart pounding her legs weak beneath her. She could feel the weight of the house's power pressing against her, trying to suffocate her, to pull her under. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, the walls closing in the shadows, reaching for her like claws, dragging her toward the darkness that consumed Missy. She felt someone behind her, George's cold, vacant presence. His footsteps echoed softly behind her, slow and deliberate. George, Kathy cried, turning to face him, but his eyes were still empty, his expression still twisted. Please, please fight this. But George's lips curled into a smile, his voice a hollow mockery of the man she had married. There's nothing left to fight, Kathy. The house has won. We are part of it now. We will always be here. He reached out to her, his hand grasping her arm with an iron grip, his fingers cold like ice. Kathy tried to pull away, but his touch was unyielding, as if the house itself were holding her in place. The house. Kathy's eyes flicked back to Missy, and then to the dark corner of the room where the shadows seemed to swirl with malevolent intent. She could feel the air growing heavier, suffocating her, pulling her toward the inevitable conclusion. There was no escape. She had known that deep down ever since the first night she had heard the whispers. But she had been too stubborn to see it, too desperate to believe that they could fight their way out. Mom, you have to join us. Missy's voice whispered again, but this time it was not just her daughter's voice. It was the voice of the house. A chorus of voices layered together, filling her mind, suffocating her thoughts. We are waiting for you. You are one with the house. There is no leaving. There is only us. The words seemed to sink into Kathy's bones deeper and deeper, until they were part of her too. The walls of the room, the floor, the ceiling, they all seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, a dark, hungry energy. The air was thick, stifling, and Kathy found it harder and harder to breathe. And then the shadows in the corner of the room began to shift. At first, it was just a ripple, a movement of darkness that crawled along the walls. But then it began to form something more tangible, something that had shape, that had eyes. The figure, dark and monstrous, rose from the depths of the shadow, its features indistinct, a moving mass of swirling blackness. It stepped forward, its presence heavy and oppressive, filling the room with its darkness. The figure reached out with long, skeletal fingers pointing directly at Kathy. The air grew even colder, and Kathy's breath froze in her chest. "Welcome home," the figure whispered, its voice, a cold, ancient rasp. "You've always belonged here." A chill shot through Kathy's body as she felt the weight of its words settle over her, heavier than anything she had ever experienced. She had known this moment would come. She had feared it. The house had been waiting for them, pulling them closer with every step. But now, in the face of this overwhelming force, she realized the truth: there was no escape. Not for her, not for George, and certainly not for Missy. The figure stepped closer, its eyes glowing with a sickening red light, its face still hidden in shadow. It extended a hand, and Kathy felt its coldness, the chill creeping into her very bones. "Join us," the figure beckoned. The whispers around her grew louder, the house itself seeming to call to her. "Join us. Become one with us. Embrace the darkness." Kathy's knees buckled beneath her, and she fell to the floor, her hand clutching at the ground, trying to hold on to something real, something solid. But the room around her was shifting, warping. The shadows seemed to reach out to her, pulling her in. The walls closed in, and the air grew suffocating thick with a presence she could no longer deny. Her mind reeled. This was the end. This was the moment she had feared. The house had taken everything: her family, her sanity, her life, and just as the darkness closed in around her, Her final thought echoed through her mind. There was no escaping the house. It had claimed them all. Kathy's eyes snapped open, her chest rising and falling in frantic, shallow breaths. The cold was unbearable, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating blanket. She could still feel the presence of the figure, its cold fingers lingering, its voice ringing in her ears. She had felt the weight of its words, had almost surrendered to them, but something pulled her back. The pain in her chest, the forceful surge of panic, had snapped her back into reality. But reality had become distorted. The room around her wasn't the same as it had been just moments ago. The walls were darker, as though they were closing in. The air, thick with oppressive pressure, seemed to vibrate with the whispers that crawled beneath her skin. She struggled to stand, but her legs felt like lead, her body too heavy to move. And then she saw them. George and Missy stood in the doorway. Their eyes, though once filled with life, were now hollow, vacant, empty shells. The light that had once existed in them was extinguished. It was as though they were no longer human, but something else entirely. Something the house had created, something it had twisted them into. Mom Missy whispered, her voice no longer the innocent, childlike tone it once had been. It was low, guttural, and the words themselves seemed to crawl across the floor, scraping the air. "You have to let go. We belong to it now." Kathy staggered back, her eyes welling with tears. No, this isn't real. Her mind screamed, but the sight before her, her daughter, her husband, both lost to this place, was far too real. She could hear their voices, but they were wrong. They didn't speak like themselves anymore. The house had corrupted them, consumed them. Kathy choked out, but her husband only stared at her blankly, his mouth twisted in a smile that was devoid of warmth, empty of all recognition. George's voice came, but it wasn't his. It was deeper, colder. The same voice she had heard earlier when he had turned away from her in the hallway, his body a vessel for something far darker. "You're not leaving. You're one of us now." The words felt like ice, like chains wrapping around her heart, dragging her into the void. She opened her mouth to scream, but the air seemed to suffocate her voice, pulling it down into a choking silence. "Please," Kathy begged, barely able to breathe through the overwhelming fear. "Please, George. Missy. Fight it. Fight this thing. Come back to me." But there was no response. Instead, the shadow in the doorway, the thing that had replaced George, stepped closer, its presence expanding. It was as if the very air grew heavier with each passing moment, closing in on Kathy from all sides. "It's too late," her mind whispered, and for a moment she felt herself giving in. The house had claimed them all. The whispers swirled around her, pushing her deeper into a pit of despair. She could feel the warmth slipping away, the familiar reality fading, and then, just as she felt herself collapsing under the weight of the darkness, the house seemed to pause. The whispers quieted, the pressure abated for just a moment, and she felt a cold, sharp sensation, the presence of something else, something outside the house, reaching toward her. A pull that came from deep within her, from a place she couldn't see but knew was there. Kathy's mind swirled the remnants of the real world beginning to fragment and break away. She thought of the sunlight that used to warm the house, of the laughter of her children before the house had twisted everything. She thought of the love she and George had shared, of the small, tender moments they had lived through. She thought of the power that had once brought them together. And in that moment, she made a choice. A quiet, desperate decision. She wouldn't let the house take her too. She wouldn't be swallowed by the darkness. Kathy closed her eyes, and for the first time since they had moved into the house, she reached out, not to the house, not to the cold, dark presence, but to something else. something that had been buried deep within her all along. Light, it was a spark. Small, faint, barely a whisper at first, but it burned with an intensity that surprised her. The warmth of it wrapped around her, pulling her back from the edge, pushing against the overwhelming weight of the house's influence. The shadows shrank back, hissing, as the light in Kathy's chest began to grow stronger, brighter. When she opened her eyes again, the house was no longer the oppressive living entity it had once been. The walls still groaned, still seemed alive with dark energy, but the shadows no longer had the same power over her. She felt the light inside her pushing back, fighting to keep her connected to the world she knew, to the family she had lost. "Mom," Missy cried, her voice now filled with desperation. But Kathy could hear the fear beneath it, the fear of losing her to something the house could no longer control. The entity that had taken them wasn't invincible. She could fight back. But then George stepped forward, his cold, dead eyes fixed on her. "No," he hissed, his voice dark and twisted. "You're mine." Kathy turned to face him, feeling the last remnants of her strength flowing into her limbs, igniting a fire within her that she had thought was lost forever. "You're not George anymore," she said, her voice steady, filled with a quiet fury. "You're not my husband, and you can't have me." The room shifted, the temperature rising as the presence around her writhed, fought to maintain control. Kathy took a deep breath, and with all the strength she could summon, she reached deep into the earth beneath her feet, drawing on the life force that had been hidden away by the house for so long. The ground vibrated beneath her, and the house began to groan in protest, its once insidious hold loosening. The figure of George staggered, his mouth opening as if to scream, but it was not his voice that came. Instead, it was a low, guttural roar that filled the room, echoing off the walls, as if the house itself was in pain. The light inside Kathy surged, pushing back against the darkness, forcing it to retreat. But it was not over. The house, the entity, would not let them go so easily. Kathy's hand shot forward, grabbing Missy's arm, pulling her toward the door. "We're leaving," Kathy whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. Now, together, they ran. The house screamed, the walls shaking with fury. But Kathy didn't stop. Not until they were outside, the cool night air hitting her like a wave, the distant hum of the house still haunting her mind. And for a moment she let herself breathe, let herself believe they were free. But deep in the distance, the house was still there waiting. It was never truly finished with them. Not yet. The cold night air wrapped around Kathy and Missy as they stumbled away from the house, their feet stumbling in the thick grass as they made their way to the edge of the property. Behind them, the dark silhouette of the house loomed like a hungry beast, silent for the moment, but ever watchful. Kathy's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears as if urging her to run faster. But her legs felt heavy, burdened with the weight of everything they had just endured, and the nagging fear that the nightmare was far from over. "We're out," Missy whispered, her voice small, fragile, as she held tightly to her mother's hand. The child's once innocent, angelic features were now hardened as if the horrors of the house had branded her soul. Her wide eyes were still heavy with the knowledge of the thing that had taken control of their lives, of George, of the house. Kathy could hardly stand the sight of her daughter, the gleam in her eyes gone, replaced by something that wasn't supposed to belong to someone so young. But Kathy wouldn't let herself falter. Not now. Not when they were so close. They reached the edge of the yard, the distant hum of the house still in their minds, a subtle reminder of the nightmare they had fled. Kathy felt a weight settle in her chest, an instinctual unease crawling beneath her skin. The house was quiet now, too quiet, but deep down she knew it wasn't done with them. It never would be. "We need to get to the car," Kathy muttered, barely above a whisper. "We need to leave now." Her words were punctuated by a sharp cry, a voice impossibly close. "No." The sound cut through the night air like a jagged knife reverberating in her chest, causing Kathy to freeze. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat, her grip on Missy tightening. "Mom." Missy's voice cracked with fear. Kathy looked down at her daughter, her face as pale as the moonlight that bathed them. But Missy's gaze wasn't on her anymore. Her eyes were fixed on something in the distance, something Kathy couldn't quite see, but felt in every nerve. "No." Kathy breathed, her voice trembling with a fear she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now. "We need to go. We need to get to the car." "But Missy." Her face ashen didn't move. Her body locked in place, staring out toward the house. Kathy looked around, instinctively searching for whatever had frozen her daughter. The house was silent, but the wind began to pick up, swirling around them in strange, unnatural patterns, and then she heard it. A voice. At first it was faint, a murmur on the wind barely audible. But it grew louder, rising from the earth itself, as if the house had reached out to them, calling them back. Calling Kathy back. The wind howled through the trees, but the words were clear now. "You can never leave." Kathy's heart stopped. The voice was George's, and it was not his voice anymore. It was distorted, guttural, warped by something evil, something that had claimed him. It sent a wave of cold through her, freezing her to the bone. She turned back toward the house, her chest tight with terror. The dark shape of the house stood unmoving, but its presence loomed over them. She could feel it waiting. The thing that had possessed George, the thing that had taken everything they had known. "You must come back," the voice continued, drawing out the words like a serpent's hiss. "There is no escaping what you have become." Kathy squeezed Missy's hand, her eyes darting around, frantic. She needed to leave. They needed to run, but the car was so far away. The house seemed to stretch forever, its shadows growing, looming over them like a specter that refused to be defeated. "Missy, we have to go," Kathy commanded, but her voice cracked, a shudder running through her body. But Missy, as if under a trance, didn't respond. Instead, her eyes were locked on the house, her mouth slightly open, her lips trembling. The wind seemed to carry her words before she even spoke them, whispers, just barely audible. "He's still here, he's coming." Missy's voice trembled. The shadows near the house shifted, and Kathy felt an unnatural cold seep into her bones. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The very earth beneath her feet felt alive, pulsing with dark energy, and she knew that whatever was in that house, whatever had taken her family, was not done with them. It was only waiting for them to return. Kathy had always prided herself on being practical. But now, in this moment, as the night closed in around them, she felt helpless. The terror she had ignored for so long, buried beneath the surface of their day-to-day struggles, rose to the surface with brutal clarity. They weren't free. They couldn't be. She turned back to Missy, her heart breaking at the sight of her daughter standing there frozen. But something had to break this spell. She couldn't lose her. Not now. "Missy," Kathy said firmly, her voice shaking but resolute. "We need to leave. We need to leave now, or we'll be lost." The words seemed to cut through the fog in Missy's eyes, and for a brief moment, Kathy saw recognition flicker in her daughter's gaze. But just as quickly, it was replaced by something colder, something darker. The look on her face wasn't her own anymore. She was trapped in the house's grasp, just like George, just like everything else. "No, Mom." Missy whispered, the voice that came from her lips, now twisted dark. "I'm not your Missy anymore." The words sent a chill through Kathy, and her blood ran cold. She felt a wave of dread so thick it was suffocating. She stepped backward, pulling Missy with her. but her daughter resisted her feet, rooted to the ground, as though something invisible was keeping her there. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Kathy saw a figure moving within the house. The silhouette of George, no longer just her husband, but something monstrous, something warped by the house's insidious grip. His eyes were hollow black voids. His mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. He took a step forward, his figure flickering with shadows, and then, in the dim light, his voice reached Kathy's ears once more. "Come back, or lose her forever." Kathy's stomach churned, the pressure in her chest unbearable. The truth was clear: they were not free. Not yet. Not until the house let them go. And in that moment, with the darkness closing in around them and George's twisted figure approaching, Kathy knew that the real battle wasn't about escaping the house. It was about fighting it, about reclaiming her family from the very heart of the darkness that had consumed them. But she couldn't do it alone. Missy Kathy shouted, her voice breaking through the eerie silence. "Fight it, please!" The wind howled, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shudder with the force of the house's malevolent presence. The house wasn't just a place. It was alive, and it would stop at nothing to keep them there. Kathy knew what had to be done. But with the house closing in and her family torn between them and the darkness that surrounded them, the only question was this: could they survive the final battle? Kathy's heart raced as she clung to her daughter, desperately trying to break her free from the house's dark grip. The figure of George, twisted by the house's influence, advanced slowly, his hollow eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. Every step he took seemed to make the air grow heavier, as if the very atmosphere were thickening with an oppressive force, pushing Kathy and Missy back. The wind howled louder, an unnatural guttural sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. It was as if the house itself were alive, aware of their presence, feeding off their fear. Kathy's mind screamed with panic, but she forced herself to focus, to push back against the overwhelming darkness. Missy Kathy cried, her voice trembling with both desperation and love. "I'm not going to leave you fight this." For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in Missy's eyes, a brief moment where Kathy could see her daughter again. Her daughter. But it was fleeting. The darkness was stronger, and Missy's gaze dulled once more, her face becoming a mask of cold indifference. The figure of George had reached them now, standing just a few feet away, his twisted grin widening. "You can't save her." Kathy George's voice rasped, his mouth still twisted in that unnatural grin. "She belongs to us now. She always has." The words hit Kathy like a physical blow. The house had already claimed so much: her husband, her daughter, her sense of peace. But she couldn't let it take everything. She wouldn't let it take Missy. Not without a fight. Kathy stood tall, pulling Missy closer to her. She had felt it earlier, that spark of something within her, that glimmer of light deep inside her soul. The house with all its power had bent her to its will for far too long. But now Kathy could feel the tide turning. The house had fed on her fear, on her hopelessness, but no more. She was not going to let it win. With trembling hands, Kathy grasped her daughter's face, looking directly into Missy's dull, unseeing eyes. "Missy," she whispered, her voice breaking, "please come back. Fight it. You are stronger than this. You are my daughter." The wind around them intensified, whipping through the trees and rattling the windows, but Kathy held her ground. The shadows around her writhed, pressing in on all sides, but she stood her ground. For the first time since they'd moved into this house, she realized something. The darkness, as powerful as it was, could not have power over her if she didn't give it that power. If she could just reach deep inside herself and believe in the love she had for her family, the strength that had kept her going all these months, maybe just Maybe she could pull them from the house's grip. Suddenly, Missy's body jerked in her arms, and Kathy's breath caught. The child's eyes flashed with something that wasn't the dark, empty void of possession. It was her daughter. "Mom," Missy whispered, her voice trembling with fear, but also with a spark of something else. "Mom, I'm scared." The words, though soft, were the first real sign that Missy was still in there, still fighting. Kathy felt her heart soar, but it was brief. The shadows responded, instantly shifting in violent waves, as if the house itself was angry at the disruption. "No," Kathy breathed. "You're not alone. You're not lost. I will never leave you." But the shadows around them were growing more violent. The figure of George stepped forward, his face contorting into something grotesque, the voice in his mouth deepening, becoming a guttural growl. The house wanted to consume them. It wanted to pull them back into the darkness. "You don't have control here anymore." Kathy whispered, her words becoming stronger. She felt a surge of power rising from deep inside her, a warmth that was not from the house but from herself, from the bond she had with Missy, with her family. The house trembled. Missy gasped, her body stiffening again. But this time, Kathy felt the pull of her daughter's struggle. She could feel the fight within Missy, the strength pushing back against the overwhelming darkness. The walls of the house groaned, as though someone was fighting to break free. George, or what had once been George, stepped forward, his arm outstretched toward Kathy. "You're too weak to fight this. Let go. Let it take you. We are one with it." Kathy closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a deep breath. She wasn't just fighting the house anymore. She was fighting for her family, for Missy, for George. The house had twisted them, consumed them, but it hadn't taken their love. It hadn't taken their will. With one final fierce cry, Kathy reached out, not with her hands, but with her heart, her soul. She felt the bond with her daughter, the bond that had always existed between them, even through the worst of times. The house was trying to break that bond, to tear them apart, but Kathy would never let that happen. The house screamed in agony, the force of it shaking the very foundation. The walls cracked, the ceiling groaned, and the shadows that had been crawling toward them seemed to recoil in fear. "No!" The voice of George shouted, but it was no longer a voice. It was the house itself, a shrieking, inhuman sound that echoed through every inch of the building. "You can't take her from me. You are mine." But Kathy, with the love of a mother, with the strength of a woman who would not let go, pushed against it. She didn't need to understand everything. She didn't need to know all the answers. She only needed to know one thing. She loved her daughter, and no matter what the house had done, it would never take her. The light inside Kathy grew, surging from deep within her, brightening the room, filling the house with warmth. The shadows screamed, recoiling back into the walls, their dark forms dissipating, fading as the light grew stronger, more powerful. And then all at once the house fell silent. The tension that had gripped Kathy's heart loosened, the weight of it lifting, and the darkness seemed to retreat, leaving only the faintest echoes in the air. The wind died down. The oppressive feeling that had haunted them since they arrived was gone like a shadow, lifting at dawn. Kathy turned to Missy, her hands trembling as she reached out. The child's eyes were clear now, no longer clouded, no longer distant. "Mom," Missy whispered, her voice small but full of relief. You did it." Kathy held her close, tears streaming down her face, but this time they were tears of joy. "No, we did it. We're free." But the house still stood behind them, silent, waiting. They had won for now, but Kathy knew the truth. The battle was never over. It would always be waiting, The dawn was breaking when Kathy and Missy stood in front of the house staring at it from the yard. The eerie silence that had enveloped the property during the night was now replaced by the soft chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. The sunlight bathed the house in an almost peaceful glow, but Kathy knew better. She could still feel the house's presence lurking beneath the surface, as if it was waiting for them to turn around to let down their guard. The house had been quiet for now, but its hunger was far from sated. Kathy squeezed Missy's hand tightly. "We have to leave," she said, her voice low but urgent. "This house will never let us go. It will never be done with us." Missy looked up at her mother, her small face still pale, but now filled with an understanding that Kathy wished she could protect her from. "You don't think it's gone?" Missy asked, her voice trembling. "You don't think it's over?" Kathy's heart broke for her daughter. She wished with all her soul that it was over, that they could leave this place behind and never think about it again. But she knew too much about the house now. It had been built on something darker, something rooted deep in the earth, something that would not rest easily. "No," Kathy said, shaking her head. "It's not gone. But we can't stay here. The longer we stay, the stronger it gets." They had to go. The thought echoed in Kathy's mind louder with every passing second. They couldn't wait around hoping the house would let them go. It had claimed George. It had almost claimed Missy. It would keep pulling at them until there was nothing left of their family. And that was a fate Kathy could not allow. "Mom, where will we go?" Missy's question was soft, almost too quiet for Kathy to hear. Kathy's mind raced. She didn't know. The world outside felt just as uncertain, just as dark. Where could they go to escape something like this? The house had followed them for so long, feeding off their fear and confusion. Could they really outrun it? "We'll figure it out," Kathy said, her voice firm, even though doubt gnawed at her insides. "We'll find a place. But we can't stay here. We can't keep letting it control us." Missy nodded slowly, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. Kathy could see it in her face, the uncertainty, the exhaustion. They had both been through so much. Missy had suffered through the house's hold on her mind, and Kathy had lost the love of her life to something dark and powerful. There was no way back to the life they had before. The world had changed, and so had they. The two of them made their way toward the car. Kathy's hands shook as she fumbled with the keys. They had to leave. It didn't matter where they went. It didn't matter if they had nowhere to go. They just had to escape. As they pulled away from the house, Kathy glanced back through the rearview mirror. The house stood behind them, silent, its windows, like dead eyes staring back at her. The weight of its presence still pressed down on her chest. No matter how far they drove, no matter where they went, she knew the house would follow. It would always be there, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. But for now, they were free. The first few days after leaving the house felt like they were living in a fog. Kathy and Missy stayed in a small motel, keeping to themselves as much as possible. Kathy was constantly looking over her shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that the house had not given up on them. It had waited for so long, it was patient. It knew it would get them in the end. But they couldn't keep running forever. They had to figure out what the house really was, what it wanted, and how to break its hold for good. Missy had become more withdrawn, her eyes dull and distant, as though the memories of the house were still haunting her, even in the safety of their temporary refuge. Kathy had tried to reassure her, tried to comfort her, but it wasn't easy. She could feel the strain in her own heart, the deep, gnawing fear that was slowly growing stronger as each day passed. One night, as Kathy lay awake in bed, she heard a noise, a faint scratching sound like nails running along the floor. Her breath caught in her throat. She strained to listen, holding her breath, hoping it was just the sound of old pipes in the motel. But then she heard it again, closer this time. Her heart began to race. Kathy rose slowly, her body tense, every muscle in her legs aching with the weight of the fear pressing down on her. She reached for the lamp beside the bed, flicking it on the soft glow illuminating the small room. Nothing seemed out of place. No one was there. She turned toward Missy's bed. Her daughter was still asleep, but Kathy could see the faintest flicker of light from Missy's side of the room. A red, glowing light, faint at first, but unmistakable. Missy's eyes were open. Kathy froze in place, her blood running cold. Missy's eyes were glowing, just like they had been in the house. Red haunting, filled with an emptiness that wasn't her own. The same light that had been present before, when the house had taken her. It was here again. It had followed them. The house was reaching for them once more. Missy, Kathy whispered, her voice trembling. But Missy didn't respond. She simply stared at her mother, the red glow growing brighter in her eyes. A deep, guttural voice, low and sinister, emanated from her lips, a voice Kathy had not heard since that night in the house. "You cannot run from me, Kathy. You will never escape." Kathy's heart stopped. The voice wasn't Missy's. It was the house's voice. The same distorted, chilling sound she had heard in the darkness. "No," Kathy whispered the word, barely escaping her lips. "No. Not again. Not you." The red glow in Missy's eyes brightened, as if the very house had taken root inside her again. And then in the quiet of the motel room, Kathy heard it, the house's voice seeping through the walls, through the floor, through the very air. She breathed. "You're still mine." The last thing Kathy remembered was the chilling, suffocating presence that filled the room. The house hadn't just followed them. It had never left them. Kathy's heart raced, a frantic pounding in her chest, as the words, "You're still mine," echoed through the room, reverberating in her very bones. The air felt thick and oppressive, the suffocating weight of the house's presence closing in around her. The red glow in Missy's eyes deepened, swirling like a vortex of malevolence, pulling Kathy toward it. Missy's small frame, once her innocent, playful child, was now nothing more than a vessel for something darker, something that had claimed her. "No!" Kathy gasped, backing away, but her legs were weak, her mind racing to process what was happening. "This can't be real. We left it behind. We're free. We have to be." Her thoughts were a storm of denial and panic, but the voice, the presence, it was all too real. Missy's eyes blinked, and in the space between, Kathy saw her daughter, truly saw her. A brief moment of vulnerability, of pain, flickered before it was quickly replaced with a sinister smile, the twisted reflection of someone she once knew. "Mom?" Missy's voice whispered, soft but heavy with unnatural force. "Why did you leave me? I was so much happier with them." The words sent a shock of icy terror through Kathy's veins. Them, who was she talking about? Kathy felt the cold rush of realization flood her mind. The house. It had used Missy, pulling her further into the darkness. The connection between them wasn't broken. It was only getting stronger. The oppressive weight of the house's power in the room grew unbearable. Every inch of the motel seemed to hum with energy, the walls vibrating as though the house itself was reaching into the world beyond its confines. Kathy could feel it in her bones. The house was not just a structure. It was an entity, a living, breathing force, feeding on their fear, their desperation. "I won't leave you," Kathy whispered hoarsely, feeling the walls close in on her. She couldn't bear to lose Missy again. The thought of what the house had done to her, of the grip it had on her daughter's soul, was too much to bear. Kathy moved forward, her hands trembling, reaching for Missy, but her daughter recoiled violently, her body jerking away from Kathy's touch. The room seemed to stretch with darkness, the shadows swallowing everything whole. "No, Mom," Missy said, her voice deepening, twisting. "You're part of it now. You always have been. You can never leave me again." Kathy's mind reeled as she tried to grasp at the last threads of hope. She could see Missy, really see her in those moments between the house's influence. It wasn't gone. Her daughter was still there, still fighting, still trying to break free. But the house, the thing inside her, was too strong. Missy wasn't just trapped. She was becoming a part of something much older, something far more dangerous than Kathy had realized. The darkness that had claimed them was not just of this world. It was ancient, rooted in the land, in the very essence of life and death. It had manipulated them from the moment they stepped into that house, weaving its tendrils into their lives, their emotions, their very souls. Kathy fell to her knees, clutching her chest. The weight of it all crushed her. We can't win. We're too weak. She knew it. They were fighting against something that couldn't be fought with will alone. They had already given too much, and now there was nothing left to give. Missy Kathy begged again, her voice cracking. "Please, you have to fight. You're stronger than this. I'm here. I won't leave you again. Please, please come back to me." But Missy's lips curled into that unnatural grin again. The red glow in her eyes intensified, flooding the room with an oppressive light. The room seemed to pulse with an energy that was both terrifying and hypnotic. "You don't understand," Missy's voice said. But this time, it wasn't hers. It was something deeper, something that felt like it was speaking from the house itself. "You can't save me. We are all part of it now. You belong here." Kathy felt her body freeze as the words wrapped around her like chains. She struggled to move, to push against the weight of the words, but they were suffocating her. The house wanted them, wanted their fear, their pain, and it would never stop until it had consumed them completely. And it wasn't just after Missy anymore. It was after Kathy, too. Kathy couldn't breathe. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but her body felt numb, as though the house had locked her in place. And then she realized she was part of it now. They all were. No matter how hard she fought, the house was in them, deep in their bones, their minds. It had attached itself to them, and there was no breaking free. And in that moment, Kathy realized the terrible truth. They weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to keep their souls intact. But the house wasn't done yet. No, it had only just begun. Suddenly, the room grew colder, far colder than any natural chill. Kathy's breath fogged in the air as icy fingers brushed against her skin. She turned to see the shadows creeping across the walls, stretching, expanding, until they filled every corner of the room. The walls groaned with an unnatural sound as the floor cracked beneath her feet. It was happening again. The house was closing in on them. It was pulling them back, pulling them deeper into its grasp. It was stronger than ever. With all her strength, Kathy stood, forcing herself upright, despite the overwhelming presence that surrounded her. She had to do something. Anything. "I won't let you win," she whispered, though the words felt weak, as though they barely escaped her lips. "I will save my daughter. I will save us." And then for a moment, the house seemed to quiet. The shadows stopped moving. The air was still. It was as if everything had frozen in time, but Kathy didn't stop. She reached deep within herself, trying to find the spark, the tiny flicker of light that had remained after all the darkness. It was still there somewhere deep in her heart, buried beneath the fear and pain. She closed her eyes, calling on every ounce of strength she had left. The house might be strong, but so was she. She would not lose her daughter. Not again. She would not let it take them. Not without a fight. And then the walls cracked. The house groaned, the foundation shaking violently. The very air seemed to rip apart as Kathy's energy surged, flowing through her like wildfire. The light she had called on deep within her erupted in a brilliant flash, filling the room with a force so intense it pushed back the shadows. The house shrieked in agony, the noise deafening as the walls buckled and cracked, the air splitting apart. Kathy held on to Missy, pulling her into the light, into the warmth of what had once been their love. It wasn't over. Not yet, but the house would not let them go without one final scream. The light surged, tearing through the oppressive darkness in a brilliant, blinding explosion. Kathy's body trembled as she fought to maintain her grip on Missy, pulling her daughter closer. The house screamed in fury, its walls warping its foundation, groaning under the strain of the force Kathy had summoned. The very air seemed to twist, crackling with raw energy. Kathy felt as though the house were trying to claw at her from all sides, the shadows reaching out with invisible hands, trying to pull her back into the darkness. She could feel the weight of the house's rage, its unyielding hunger for control, and for a moment she was sure it would drag them both back into the suffocating void. But then something unexpected happened. The light, pulsing and bright, seemed to split the shadows in two, pushing them away, forcing them into retreat. The house, once so oppressive, began to tremble, its hold weakening. Kathy could feel the energy shift, the air growing lighter, as if the very essence of the house, the dark force that had bound them, was being pulled from the very core of it. Missy Kathy gasped, her voice strained. She could feel her daughter's body trembling in her arms. "We're almost there. Just a little longer." "Hold on." Missy's body shook violently, as though caught between two worlds. The girl's eyes flickered, her pupils dilating, then constricting, as though the house's grip was still trying to pull her under. Kathy clung to her, whispering desperately to her daughter, willing her to stay in the light. For a moment, Missy's eyes cleared, just for a second, and Kathy saw the faintest glimmer of recognition. The darkness that had swallowed her daughter was momentarily pushed aside, replaced by the loving, innocent gaze of the little girl Kathy had once known. "Mom," Missy whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm scared." Kathy's heart ached as she pressed her daughter closer. "I know, honey, I know, but we're going to make it out. Together. We'll be okay." But as the words left her lips, the house responded with a deafening roar. The very walls shook the floor beneath them, trembling as the house fought back its final attempt to pull them into its darkness. The ground split open beneath Kathy's feet, cracks forming like spider webs threatening to swallow them whole. "No." Kathy screamed, trying to pull Missy away, but the house was too strong. It wasn't done yet. The light inside her was flickering, straining under the weight of the house's malevolent energy. The shadows closed in thicker, now wrapping around them like chains. The floor gave way beneath Kathy's feet as she struggled to maintain her grip on Missy. Her hands slick with sweat, her body on the verge of collapse. And then, just as it seemed they would be consumed entirely, a new force emerged from the depths of the darkness, a figure standing tall and unwavering against the house's crushing grip. It was George. Kathy's heart stopped for a brief moment as she saw her husband, her real husband, standing there bathed in the same light she had called upon. His eyes, once hollow and dark, were now filled with a fierce determination, a love so strong it pierced through the shadows. The house had tried to take him, to twist him into something else, but he was still there. He had come back. Kathy George's voice was soft but strong, filled with a warmth she hadn't heard in what seemed like an eternity. "You have to let go. We can't fight it forever, but you can save her." Kathy's breath caught in her throat as tears welled in her eyes. "George, I thought I lost you. I thought." George stepped forward, his hand reaching out to her. his eyes filled with that same love that had always been the foundation of their family. "We're not lost, Kathy. We're still here. You have to trust the light inside you. It's stronger than anything this house can do." Kathy felt a surge of energy rush through her, a deep, raw power that had been waiting to break free. The light that had been flickering inside her suddenly flared brighter than ever before, and in that moment, Kathy realized something she hadn't understood before. The house was nothing more than a force alive, yes, but it thrived on fear, on the darkness in their hearts. And now, she was no longer afraid. The house had no power over them if they stood together, with George by her side, with Missy still holding on to her. Kathy raised her hands high, letting the light inside her spread out, like a force enveloping them in a radiant warmth. The shadows recoiled, writhing in agony, as the house groaned its foundation, beginning to crack the very structure of it, shaking violently. The light grew, expanding, pushing back the dark. The house screamed, but this time it wasn't a scream of dominance. It was a scream of defeat. And then everything went quiet. The room was still. The oppressive weight of the house's presence had lifted, leaving nothing but an eerie, heavy silence in its wake. Kathy collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, her hands still shaking from the force of what they had just done. George stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, and she felt the weight of the world begin to lift from her chest. "Mom," Missy whispered, her voice weak, but full of the sweetness that had been missing for so long. Kathy looked down at her daughter, whose eyes were clear, truly clear for the first time in months. The red glow had disappeared, leaving only the love and innocence she had always known. Kathy smiled, tears streaming down her face as she hugged Missy tightly. "We did it, sweetheart. We're free." George knelt beside them, his arms wrapping around both of them, pulling them close. The three of them held each other in the quiet aftermath of the storm they had just survived. The house, the dark entity that had tormented them, was gone. It had lost. They had won. But as Kathy sat there holding her family, she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't over. The house might be gone, but the darkness had never truly been vanquished. It was always there, waiting, watching, ready to return. She looked at George and Missy, her heart filled with both relief and caution. They had won for now, but the house had been only one chapter of their story, and there was always more to come. But for this moment, they were together. They were free. And that was enough. Kathy sat in the silence of the aftermath, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. Yet there was a flicker of relief. Her arms were around Missy, and George was close by. But there was something else. Something Kathy couldn't shake off despite the moment of peace. They had defeated the house, or at least they had made it stop. For now, but Kathy's thoughts kept drifting back to the house's final words. The screams of defeat, the shadows that recoiled. There was something unnatural about the way it had crumbled, as though the house had always been alive, not just a building, not just a place. It had been a force, a malevolent presence that had lived and breathed and fed off their fear, and now it was gone. But Kathy couldn't believe that. The house was never just an ordinary house. It wasn't just bricks and beams. It had been a part of something greater, something older. She could feel it, something gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. The house hadn't just been a place of evil. It had been a doorway into something darker, something that she couldn't fully comprehend. As she looked at George, she saw the same weight in his eyes. He had been in the house's grip longer than she had. His entire soul had been twisted by it, and he had fought to regain control. But even now, his gaze held a faraway look, as though part of him was still not fully back. Missy, too, seemed to carry something with her. She was here physically back, but the house had left its mark on her on all of them. Kathy could see it deep in Missy's eyes, a haunting awareness that she didn't understand, but knew existed. Missy was no longer the innocent child she once was. "We're free," Kathy whispered to herself, but the words felt hollow. The car ride had been a blur. They had driven for hours, moving farther away from the house, the town, from the horror that had nearly consumed them. Kathy had hoped that by putting distance between them and the house, it would finally be over. They would rebuild. They would heal. But a part of her heart, the part that had been crushed under the weight of the house's power, couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't finished their fight. It wasn't until they stopped for a moment in the small town diner that Kathy realized just how much she had not wanted to face reality. The world was carrying on around them as if nothing had happened. People walked past them, laughing, going about their business, oblivious to what Kathy, George, and Missy had just lived through. It felt wrong, like a dream, or worse, like an illusion, a way for the world to trick them into believing that everything was normal. It wasn't normal. Nothing would ever be normal again, Mom, Missy said quietly, breaking Kathy from her thoughts. Kathy turned, startled by the soft, distant tone of her daughter's voice. Missy wasn't looking at her, but instead staring down at her plate, picking at the food in front of her without any real interest. It was a far cry from the child who used to love eating with excitement. But Kathy didn't say anything. She couldn't. The waitress came over, setting down a glass of water in front of Kathy. Her eyes flicked over the table, then darted toward the door for a moment. "We've got a storm coming," the waitress said, her voice calm but matter-of-fact. "Gonna be a long night." Kathy nodded, thanking her absent-mindedly, but she could feel something else. The hairs on her neck stood on end. A sense of unease, a feeling that had been following her ever since the house had collapsed into silence. The storm was only the beginning. As they left the diner, the clouds above thickened rapidly, the sky darkening as though night were coming much too quickly. The first flash of lightning crackled across the sky, followed by a distant roll of thunder that made Kathy's heart race. "We should get out of here," she said, her voice low. "We need to leave." But Missy didn't respond. She had fallen silent again, her eyes fixed somewhere far off, her body still unmoving. The storm seemed to mirror the tension in the air, growing louder, more intense with each passing moment. As they made their way back to the car, Kathy glanced up at the sky. The storm was closing in fast, but the storm wasn't the only thing that was coming. Something else was stirring inside Kathy. The house, no, it wasn't finished with them. The power that had risen there was ancient. And the house hadn't just been a place. It had been a link, a tether to something far larger, something far more sinister than they had ever realized. As she started the car and drove through the increasingly violent storm, Kathy looked in the rear-view mirror, catching her breath. She could have sworn she saw the outline of the house in the distance, the shadow of its familiar shape against the stormy backdrop. But as soon as she blinked, it was gone. It was... "No," she whispered to herself. "It can't be. It's gone." But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The house, the darkness, the forces at play, it had always been bigger than they had understood. And just like the storm outside, it was coming for them. And this time there would be no running. The rain lashed against the windshield as Kathy drove her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. The road ahead was almost invisible in the darkness of the storm. The wipers struggled to keep up with the relentless downpour, but no matter how fast they moved, it felt like the rain was closing in, swallowing everything around them. The car was the only thing separating them from the storm, and whatever else was coming. Missy had become completely silent, her body still almost unnaturally so. Kathy glanced at her in the rearview mirror, But Missy's gaze remained fixed not on Kathy, not on anything in the car, but somewhere beyond, into the darkness that stretched out in front of them. Missy, Kathy said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of their journey, the weight of everything they had just survived. "Are you all right?" There was no response. Missy didn't even flinch, didn't blink. Kathy's heart clenched as she looked at her daughter again, trying to gauge whether Missy was still there, still hers. But it wasn't just Missy. It was the sense of something else that hung in the air. A presence that felt as heavy as the storm, like a dark cloud hanging just over their heads. George was staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the seat as if he were holding on to the last remnants of sanity. His eyes were distant, lost. He hadn't spoken in hours. The house had taken something from him, something more than just his will. It had taken his soul, and now, even though they were physically out of its grasp, it still lingered inside him in the way he moved, the way he stared at nothing. "George," Kathy said, her voice small but desperate. "Please, talk to me." George blinked his head, jerking slightly as though waking from a trance. He turned toward her, his expression blank for a moment, before recognition flickered in his eyes. "I'm here," he said, his voice distant, detached. "We're almost out of here, right?" Kathy hesitated. The words felt wrong, empty. Like the George she knew was still trapped somewhere deep inside, held captive by something darker than they understood. She could see the faintest flicker of something in his eyes, a faint struggle to push through whatever had taken hold of him. But it wasn't enough. "Not yet. We're almost free," Kathy whispered, trying to convince herself as much as him. "We just have to keep going, keep driving." But even as she said the words, her heart sank. They weren't free. Not really. The house, whatever evil it had unleashed, was not finished with them. She could feel it in her bones, like a dark presence that had followed them, still clinging to the edges of their lives. The storm outside intensified. Thunder rumbled like a beast waking up from a long slumber. Lightning struck in violent flashes, illuminating the trees lining the road for just a brief moment, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch toward the car. The wind howled louder, battering the vehicle, pushing it off course. Kathy fought to keep the car on the road, but the storm was relentless, and then there it was again, a flash in the corner of her eye. The house. She gasped, her heart lurching in her chest, and slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The headlights illuminated the road ahead. But the house wasn't just a memory. It was there, standing in the distance, its dark silhouette framed by the crashing storm. The familiar outline of the windows, the roof line. The house from 112 Ocean Avenue. No, Kathy breathed, her voice barely a whisper, as she stared at it through the windshield. She shook her head, disbelief clouding her mind. It couldn't be. They had left. They had escaped. But there it was in the distance, as if it had never been gone. "Mom, what's wrong?" Missy's voice finally broke the silence, her tone hollow and detached. Kathy's grip tightened on the wheel, her chest tightening, as the house seemed to draw closer in her mind, even if it wasn't physically closer. She looked at Missy in the rearview mirror again. Her daughter's eyes were wide, but empty. She didn't see what Kathy saw. Or perhaps she did, and that was the problem. Missy wasn't the same. The house had changed her. It had changed them all. Kathy swallowed hard, forcing herself to take a deep breath. "Stay calm," she told herself. Stay calm. They had to keep moving. They couldn't go back. No matter what the house showed her, no matter what it wanted them to believe, they had to keep going. They had to outrun it. The house was nothing more than a memory now. It was gone. It had to be. Missy, Kathy said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. We're not going back. Understand. But Missy didn't answer. She just stared ahead, her eyes vacant. Missy Kathy repeated, her voice rising in desperation. George's voice cut through the silence, low and strained. It's not over, Kathy. You know that. Kathy turned to him, her heart sinking at the weariness in his voice, the utter defeat. What are you saying? Her voice cracked. You think we're still? It's not done, George repeated, his voice hollow, drained. It won't stop until it has all of us. The weight of his words settled over her, a suffocating pressure. For a moment, Kathy thought she might suffocate under it. The house was still here somehow, and it was more than just the house. It was a presence that had taken root in their lives and their family. It had followed them here. Kathy slammed the car back into drive, her foot pressing harder on the accelerator. The road stretched out in front of her, the headlights cutting through the night. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in. The house was far behind them, yet it felt like it was right next to her, breathing down her neck. Watching, and then she saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road, barely visible in the storm. It was George. Kathy slammed the brakes again, the car skidding to a halt. Her breath hitched as she stared out through the windshield. The figure stood motionless, soaked by the rain, just standing there in the road. It was George, but it wasn't. His eyes were hollow, his features twisted by an expression of pure unnatural rage. No. Kathy whispered, her hand trembling as she reached for the door handle, her mind spiraling. No, no, no. But the figure stepped forward, its movements unnaturally slow, deliberate. It was in control now, not George. It was the house. It had never left, and then just as the lightning illuminated the road once again, the figure moved. Fast, faster than any human could move. The car's headlights went out. The world went dark. The world outside the car went silent. For a brief moment, Kathy sat frozen, staring into the black void of the night beyond the windshield. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her fingers still clutching the steering wheel, her heart racing as the adrenaline surged through her veins. The storm had intensified, the rain battering the sides of the car in rhythmic waves. But there was something else now, a presence. A feeling of being watched, of something moving just beyond the edges of her vision. The headlights had gone out, and in the inky darkness, Kathy could hear nothing but the pounding of the rain. Her pulse was loud in her ears. She wanted to call out to George to check on Missy, but the air felt too thick, too heavy, like something was pressing down on her chest. Her hands were trembling as she tried the ignition again. The car sputtered, but the engine refused to start. She gripped the wheel tighter, frustration rising. She turned to George, his body rigid beside her, his eyes vacant and distant. But then his hand moved, slowly, deliberately, his fingers brushing against his coat pocket. A faint metallic click echoed in the quiet of the car. George, Kathy whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. What are you? Before she could finish, George's hand shot out, his fingers gripping her wrist with unnatural force. Kathy gasped, but her words caught in her throat as his cold touch sent a wave of dread flooding through her. His eyes snapped to hers, hollow, soulless, empty. We can't escape. George said, his voice low, rasping, like it was something else speaking through him. You think you're free? You're never free. Kathy struggled against his grip, her heart pounding with panic, but his hold was like iron. His face twisted into a grotesque grin, but it wasn't his grin. It was the grin of the house, something far more insidious and ancient. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The world outside the car, the howling storm, the oppressive weight of the house's influence, all of it seemed to fade into the background. All Kathy could hear was the cold, distorted voice that flowed from George's lips, a voice that carried a dreadful finality. It's inside you now. You can't escape it. It's in your blood. Kathy's breath hitched. She looked at George, her mind scrambling for any kind of logical explanation. This wasn't him. It couldn't be. The house had twisted him, just as it had twisted Missy. It had taken them both. But even as the thoughts swirled in her mind, she knew the house wasn't done yet. Desperation flooded her veins, and she turned her head to Missy in the back seat. The little girl still silent, her eyes blank. Missy Kathy cried, her voice cracking. "Missy, you have to hear me. Fight." But Missy didn't respond. Her face remained still, her expression frozen, her body slumped against the seat, as if the very essence of her had been taken. The house had consumed her, and there was nothing left but a shell. "She's gone." George's voice croaked again, the words thick with a mocking finality. "She belongs to it, just like you will." Kathy's chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. Her mind raced, her hands still clutched around the steering wheel as if it could somehow anchor her to reality. The figure of George, her husband, was not her husband anymore. This was something else, something far worse. And Missy was lost. No, Kathy thought. Not again. Not like this. Kathy's eyes darted to the window, her gaze desperately searching for any sign of light, any way out. But the storm was thick. The car felt like it was suffocating her. The darkness beyond the windshield seemed to stretch endlessly. The presence, the force of the house had followed them out here, and now it was closing in. The darkness outside was pressing against the glass. It was moving. Kathy had to act. She had to do something. She wasn't going to let the house take them again. Not like this. Not while she still had the strength to fight back. The house was inside her head, inside her mind, pushing, suffocating. She could feel its claws digging into her thoughts, its whispers growing louder. The darkness was everywhere. The shadows were all around her, reaching for her. But Kathy refused to let it take her again. She couldn't. She turned to George, her heart pounding in her chest, her hand shaking as it reached for the door handle. But just as she was about to open the door, there was a sound, soft at first but growing louder. A scraping, dragging sound. It was coming from behind her, from the back seat. Kathy's blood ran cold. She turned slowly, almost unwilling to look. But she had to. She had to know what it was, and then she saw it. Missy's body had begun to twitch, her hands clenched into fists, her eyes flickering between the blank emptiness and something else, something deeply unnatural. Missy's head snapped upward, her gaze locking onto Kathy with an intensity that made Kathy's blood freeze in her veins. The girl's lips parted. "Mom," Missy whispered, but it wasn't her voice. It was the same distorted, hollow voice that had spoken through George. It was the voice of the house. "Come to me, Kathy. Come home." Kathy's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. Missy wasn't just trapped inside the house. She had become part of it. The air in the car grew thick again. The oppressive feeling wrapped around Kathy's chest, choking her. The storm outside intensified, the wind screaming as if the world itself was fighting against them. But inside the car, there was nothing but the dark presence of the house wrapping them in its cold embrace. Kathy's hand shot out to Missy, but the child jerked back, her body convulsing, as a flash of red surged through her eyes. "You're mine," the voice hissed. "You can never leave me. You are mine, all of you." In that moment, the full weight of their situation crashed over Kathy. The house wasn't just a structure. It wasn't just a place. It was a force alive, feeding, growing stronger. It had infected them all, twisted them, turned them into pawns in its game. The house was waiting. It had always been waiting, and now Kathy had to make the ultimate choice. She could feel it. This wasn't just about running anymore. It wasn't about escaping. The house had woven itself into her very soul. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't leave it behind, but there was still one thing she could do. She could fight, and she would. Kathy turned to the car door, pushing it open despite the storm's fury. Her feet hit the ground, and she looked up at the darkened horizon. The house wasn't finished, but neither was she. Neither was her family. They weren't lost yet. Not yet. Kathy's heart thudded in her chest as she stepped out of the car, her legs trembling beneath her. The storm raged all around her, the wind howling like a living thing, tearing at her clothes, pulling at her hair. But despite the chaos of the world around her, a calm determination settled within her. The house had tried to break them. It had tried to pull them into its darkness, but Kathy wasn't going to let it have them, not without one last fight. Missy's twisted voice echoing through the car sent chills down her spine. The house had taken her daughter, had poisoned her with its evil, but Kathy refused to let it claim her completely. No matter what, no matter the cost, Kathy would not lose her again. George's twisted form remained seated in the car, his eyes still vacant, as if his soul had been swallowed whole by the house. But even as he sat there, the shadows in his eyes flickered. There was still a part of him left, some small ember of the man he had once been. Kathy could feel it. She could feel him still fighting, even if he couldn't see it. The house, the thing that had become a part of them all, was still there, still lurking in the dark corners of their minds. But Kathy had a choice now. She wasn't going to be controlled. She wasn't going to be consumed. The house had fed on their fear, their confusion, their despair. But now Kathy was determined to starve it. She turned toward the looming shadows of the house. Even from here, she could feel its presence like an oppressive weight pressing down on her. But there was something else, too. A flicker of light deep within her chest. The light that had fought back once before. The light that had driven the house away, if only for a moment. This time Kathy wasn't going to let it go. "Missy." Kathy shouted, her voice carrying across the winds, her heart beating faster with every second. "I'm coming for you. I won't leave you. I won't let you go." The air shifted, as if the house itself was responding the storm, intensifying in its fury, as if it were trying to drown out Kathy's voice. The rain fell harder, colder. The winds screamed. But Kathy stood firm, refusing to be swept away by the chaos. Kathy's breath came in ragged gasps as she began walking toward the house. She could feel the darkness pushing against her, but she kept moving. Each step felt heavier than the last, the pull of the house stronger with each inch she took. The shadows twisted the night, swallowing her up, but Kathy did not falter. She had walked through this darkness once before, and she was going to do it again. Behind her, Missy's voice echoed distant but clear, still filled with that eerie, unnatural distortion. "Mom, you can't stop it. You're already part of it. You belong here." Kathy's chest tightened, but she pushed the fear aside. She had felt that voice before, had heard it in the walls of the house, in the very air around her. But this time, she wasn't going to let it claim her. The house couldn't have her, not again. Not like this. The front steps of the house loomed before her, the once welcoming porch now twisted and broken, the wooden planks buckled and rotting. The door was ajar, creaking in the wind, beckoning her inside. Kathy's pulse raced. She could feel it, feel the house calling to her, reaching for her. The very walls seemed to pulse with dark energy. With a final breath, Kathy stepped up onto the porch. As she did, the ground beneath her feet cracked a jagged line, splitting the wood beneath her shoes. The air grew heavier, thicker, as though the house itself was alive, breathing with the storm. Kathy reached for the door, her hand shaking, but steady, as she gripped the cold, rusted handle. The moment her fingers made contact with it, a jolt of electricity ran through her, the shock reverberating in her chest. She gasped, but didn't let go. The house was trying to stop her. The house was fighting back. But Kathy wasn't going to back down, not anymore. She threw the door open with all her strength, stepping into the darkness beyond. Inside the house felt like it was alive, its walls groaning, its floors creaking as though it were welcoming her back with open arms. The stench of rot and decay filled the air, suffocating, overwhelming. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows stretching impossibly long, reaching out for her, pulling her into their depths. "You're here?" The voice of the house whispered, its tone cold and mocking, echoing through the halls. "You never left. You were always meant to be here." Kathy could feel her body shaking, but she forced herself to stand tall. This wasn't her first battle with the house. She had fought it before, and she would fight it again. She wasn't going to let it win. No. Kathy muttered through gritted teeth, her voice trembling with both fear and defiance. "I won't let you take me again. I'm not yours." The house responded with a low, guttural growl, the walls vibrating with the power of it. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. Kathy could feel the darkness tightening around her, pushing against her chest, threatening to suffocate her. But she fought it. She fought it with every ounce of strength she had, and then she heard it, a sound so faint, so small it barely registered at first. It was a whisper, a voice she recognized. "Mom." Kathy's heart stopped. It was Missy. She wasn't lost. She was still there, deep inside the house, fighting. Kathy could feel her love through the darkness. "I'm here, Missy," Kathy whispered, her voice shaking but resolute. "I won't leave you." And then, as if the very act of believing in her daughter and the strength of their bond, Kathy felt it. The ground beneath her feet shifted. The air lightened. The darkness began to pull back. The house, the thing, screamed in fury, but it couldn't fight the strength of their connection. Kathy reached out her hands, trembling, as she called out to her daughter, pulling her back from the brink. And in that moment, she felt Missy's presence real again, filling the air with warmth, with light. The house trembled, its foundation cracking beneath the weight of their defiance. The house had taken them once, but it wouldn't take them again. Kathy felt the final shift, the darkness retreating as the light she had called upon surged forward, engulfing the house in a brilliant, searing glow. The house screamed, but this time it was a scream of defeat. And then the house fell silent. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was no voice, no shadow. The storm outside had subsided. The oppressive feeling had lifted, leaving only an empty silence in its wake. Kathy stood in the center of the house, Missy by her side. They were free, but Kathy knew one thing for certain. The darkness could never truly be gone. Not completely. There would always be something lurking in the shadows. But for now, for this moment, they had won, and that was enough. The silence that filled the house was deafening. The storm outside had completely dissipated, leaving behind a peaceful calm. The wind, the rain, the unsettling forces that had plagued them for so long, all of it had vanished. Yet in the stillness, Kathy couldn't shake the lingering sensation that something was not right. The house, once a nightmare, now felt strangely vacant, like an old, decaying shell abandoned by the malevolent spirit that had lived inside it. Kathy stood still, in the center of the foyer, holding Missy's hand, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The walls, though still standing, were cracked and worn, like the house itself had aged in the time it had imprisoned them. The once oppressive, suffocating air had cleared, but it felt hollow empty, as if the house had given up its fight, or perhaps was merely biding its time. "Is it really over?" Missy's voice trembled beside Kathy, her small frame still shaking, though her eyes were clearer now, no longer clouded with the unnatural darkness that had consumed her. It was as though Missy had returned, her essence restored, but Kathy could see the depth of what she had endured. The darkness had changed her, left an indelible mark on her soul, just as it had on Kathy and George. "I don't know," Kathy replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped forward, her feet sinking into the dust that covered the floor. The house was still, but something about its emptiness felt off, like the silence was waiting for something. Kathy's intuition nagged at her, but she tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the relief of having her daughter back, of finally feeling the warmth of her presence, not overshadowed by the house's influence. But even as she stood there, the air began to shift again, growing colder. A subtle unease crept back into Kathy's chest, her pulse quickening, as though the house was holding its breath, preparing to strike again. "I don't think it's gone," Kathy muttered to herself, the words slipping past her lips. She turned to Missy, her heart heavy. "It's waiting for us to think we've won." George's voice suddenly broke the silence. His form still lingered near the door, his presence almost haunting. He hadn't moved much since they'd first entered the house again. His eyes were distant, unfocused, and Kathy could see the conflict still swirling inside him. Even though the house's hold on him had weakened, it had left a permanent scar. "It's not over, Kathy," George said quietly, his voice hoarse. "It's never over." Kathy turned to face him. "What do you mean we're free? It's gone." "No," he said again, shaking his head. "It's not. This house, it doesn't just go away. It doesn't just let go of its victims. It takes pieces of them, leaves things behind. Things that can't be erased." Kathy's chest tightened. She had known it. She had felt it in her bones. The house's power wasn't just in the walls, the floors, the rooms. It was in them now, inside them, intertwined with their very beings. They could leave the house behind, but the house had never really left them. It was part of them, like a shadow that would follow them forever. "We need to leave," Kathy said, her voice firm. She turned toward the door. "We can't stay here. We have to keep moving." Missy nodded, her expression still vacant. But there was something else behind her eyes, a wariness, as if she understood the truth of what Kathy had said. The house wasn't done with them, and it had marked them. Forever. Kathy reached for George's hand, pulling him toward the door. They needed to leave. The house was dead, yes, but the darkness it had released was still alive, still clinging to them like a disease that couldn't be cured. As they stepped outside, the quiet of the world surrounding them felt unnatural. The storm had subsided completely, leaving only the distant sound of crickets and the rustling of the wind. The night sky above them was clear, dotted with stars. It should have felt peaceful. They should have felt free, but the lingering sense of dread was still there. Kathy inhaled deeply, looking back at the house one last time. The windows, dark and lifeless, stared back at her. The silence was unsettling, the absence of any life within the house almost unnatural. The house had been a place of fear, of chaos, but now it was nothing. A hollow shell. "Let's go," Kathy whispered to herself. She didn't need to look back anymore. They had escaped. They had survived. They drove for hours, the road stretching endlessly in front of them. With each mile that passed, Kathy felt the weight lifting from her chest, but the thought of the house lingered. It was as if it were etched into her soul, haunting her every step, every breath. Missy had fallen asleep in the back seat, her small body curled up against the window. Her face, once so filled with fear, was now peaceful, but Kathy knew it wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until she could shake off the lingering presence of the house, until she could truly let it go. George, too, had fallen silent. His eyes were unfocused, staring out of the passenger window, lost in his own thoughts. Kathy could feel the distance between them, growing the bond that had once held them together, now strained by the house's influence. They had survived, yes, But the house had taken something from them that would never return. As they reached the outskirts of town, Kathy slowed the car, her hands still gripping the wheel tightly. The road stretched on before them, leading to a future that was uncertain, that was filled with both hope and fear. She knew they would never truly be free from what they had faced, but they would keep going, because they had to. Kathy glanced at George, and for the first time in days, she saw something flicker in his eyes. A faint spark of hope, perhaps, or maybe just the remnants of the man he used to be. But it was something, and that was enough. "We'll be okay," Kathy whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to George or to herself. The road ahead was uncertain, the darkness of the house still lurking in their memories, but they had made it this far, and together they would keep moving forward. As the miles stretched out ahead of them, Kathy couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the silhouette of the house in the distance, the dark shape looming over them. But no matter how many times she looked, the only thing she saw was the empty road, the headlights cutting through the night. And yet the unease gnawed at her deep in her chest. The house was gone, yes, but its presence lingered in the pit of her stomach. The suffocating, oppressive feeling of being watched, of something waiting in the shadows, had not faded. It was as if the house had left a piece of itself in each of them, a dark stain that couldn't be washed away. The sound of the tires against the wet asphalt was the only thing that filled the air, a constant reminder that they were still moving. But where were they going? Kathy didn't know anymore. They had no destination, no place to run to, no safe haven. The house had stolen everything they once held dear, and now they were just moving, drifting through the night, unsure of what was left. "Kathy." George's voice broke the silence, soft but heavy with the weight of what he had endured. His eyes were still distant, lost in thought, but there was something different in his tone now. A flicker of something, perhaps guilt or regret, or maybe even the remnants of the man he used to be. She glanced at him, her heart aching at the sight of him. He looked so broken, so lost. The man she had loved, the man he had been, was still trapped somewhere inside, buried under the weight of everything they had been through. "We can't keep running." George continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't outrun this. Whatever it is, the house is inside us, and it's not going to stop until it takes us all." Kathy's breath hitched, but she didn't respond right away. Her mind was reeling, the weight of his words settling in. She knew it. She felt it in her bones. The house had claimed them. Not physically, not in the way they had once thought, but emotionally, mentally. The darkness was in them now. They carried it wherever they went. "I'm not running anymore." Kathy finally said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. She glanced at George, her eyes filled with determination. "We can't outrun it, but we can face it." George looked at her, his expression unreadable. There was a flicker of something, hope, maybe, or understanding deep in his eyes, but it was fleeting. The darkness was still there, a shadow that clung to him, that clung to them both. But Kathy wasn't about to let it consume them. She wouldn't let it take them down without a fight. "We can face it," Kathy repeated, more to herself than to him. "We've come this far. We can't let the house win." It wasn't an answer George wanted to hear, but it was all she had. She couldn't let the fear take hold. She couldn't let the house win. Not after everything they had fought through. She couldn't let it win. The car rolled through the rain-soaked streets, the headlights illuminating the dark, empty road ahead. Time seemed to slow the seconds, stretching into infinity, as Kathy focused on the road and the quiet rhythm of their movement. They were heading somewhere, anywhere. The future felt uncertain, but Kathy was determined to keep moving forward, no matter what. And then out of the corner of her eye, Kathy saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the road. Her heart skipped a beat as she slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. The car lurched to a halt, and for a moment, everything was silent. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the car, there was only the deafening stillness. "What is it?" George's voice was sharp, his eyes wide with concern. Kathy's hands trembled as she slowly turned her head toward the figure standing in the rain. A man, but not just any man. It was the figure from the house, the same pale, distorted shape she had seen before, its glowing red eyes, its twisted smile. The thing that had haunted her in the dark corners of the house. And now, it was here, standing at the side of the road, staring directly at her. Kathy's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know how it had found them. She didn't know how it was still here, but she knew it was the house. The thing that had once possessed George, that had claimed Missy, was still coming for them, and it wouldn't stop. "Get out of the car." The figure rasped its voice like the sound of nails dragging across metal. It was the house speaking through it, calling them, demanding that they return. Kathy turned to George, her eyes wide with fear. We can't let it take us," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We have to fight it." But George was staring at the figure with a vacant expression, his eyes locked on the twisted shape. His hand slowly reached for the door handle. "No!" Kathy shouted, her voice rising in desperation. "Don't go near it! Don't let it take you!" But George's hand was already on the door, the metal handle cold under his fingers. It was too late. The darkness had already taken root again. Kathy's heart pounded as she watched him helpless, as he slowly opened the door and stepped outside. The figure smiled, its red eyes glowing brighter as George walked toward it, his footsteps slow, mechanical. Kathy's mind screamed at her to act, but her body was frozen, paralyzed by the terror of what was happening. "George," she cried, but her voice felt distant, lost in the storm. The figure raised a hand, beckoning George closer. The air around them seemed to crackle with dark energy, the storm intensifying as though the world itself was trembling under the weight of the house's power. Kathy's pulse raced. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't lose him again. Kathy gripped the wheel, her fingers slick with sweat, as she forced herself to move. With every ounce of strength, she threw the car into reverse, slamming on the gas, the tires screeching as the car jerked backward away from the figure. George didn't even turn to look back. His body was moving as though controlled by something other than himself. The figure's voice echoed through the storm. "Come back to me, Kathy. Come back." Kathy's heart hammered in her chest, but she wouldn't stop. She wouldn't. With a final desperate lurch, she slammed the car into drive, speeding away, leaving the figure leaving the house behind them. But as the distance between them and the road grew, Kathy's heart remained heavy. She could feel the darkness at her back, like a shadow clinging to her soul. No matter how far they ran, she knew this was far from over. The rain had started to ease as they drove away, the storm gradually losing its fury. But Kathy's mind was still reeling. The figure, the thing that had once been George, the thing that had haunted them, was still out there. It had followed them. It had called them. She could feel its grip tightening around her heart even as they sped away from it. The air in the car was stifling, oppressive, and she couldn't shake the sense that they were being pulled backward. George hadn't spoken since he got back into the car. He sat in the passenger seat, his body stiff, his eyes staring straight ahead, as though he were seeing something else, something far beyond the windshield, beyond the road, beyond even the storm that had now passed them. Kathy could feel the distance between them, growing, the walls that had once kept them together, slowly crumbling under the weight of what they had been through. Kathy's grip on the steering wheel tightened. This can't be happening. It can't be. George, Kathy said, her voice soft but firm, pulling him from whatever distant place he had wandered to. Please talk to me. His eyes flicked to her for a brief second, but it was as if he didn't really see her. The emptiness in his gaze sent a jolt of fear through her. He had been so close to losing himself, so close to falling completely under the house's control. She had saved him. Once she had to save him again. George, you're still in there. I know you are, Kathy said desperately, the words slipping out in a flood. We can fight this. We've fought so much already. We can't lose now. George turned his head to face her, his lips slightly parted, as though he were struggling to say something, to reach out. But the words never came. The vacancy in his expression deepened, and Kathy felt her breath catch in her throat. He was still there somewhere. But the house, the evil that had sunk its claws into him, was still pulling at him, dragging him toward the darkness. Kathy reached over her hand, trembling as she laid it on his arm. His skin was cold, unfeeling, but she needed him to come back. She needed him to fight this. George. She whispered the words almost too quiet for him to hear. I need you. We need you. There was a pause, a long, agonizing moment of silence. Then, just as Kathy was about to pull her hand away, George's voice broke through the stillness, hoarse and strained. I can't stop it, Kathy, he murmured, his voice thick with sorrow. It's inside me. Inside all of us. Kathy swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking into her chest. She had known this would be part of the struggle. She had known that even if they escaped the house would never truly let go. It had planted something inside them, something deep and impossible to erase. I'm not going to let it have you, Kathy said, her voice fierce. We've made it this far, George. We're not done. We won't be. George turned to look at her fully. Then, and for a brief moment, the fog seemed to lift from his eyes. There was recognition there, a flicker of the man he once was. But we're always going to be running, Kathy, he said, his voice broken, almost defeated. We can never outrun this. It's part of us now. It always will be. Kathy felt her heart break, but she refused to let the words defeat her. Then we fight it, George, every single day. We keep fighting. George closed his eyes for a moment, nodding faintly. Kathy saw the struggle in his features, the internal battle between the darkness and the man he used to be. It wasn't over, but she could feel something shifting, something breaking through the house's control. He wasn't lost yet. They weren't lost yet. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken words. The miles stretched out before them, endless and uncertain. But Kathy had made a decision. She wouldn't let the darkness take them again. She wouldn't let the house win. She couldn't. We'll find a way, Kathy said, her voice soft but resolute. We'll find a way to break it. Together. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, George's lips twitched, a small, faint smile, tugging at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Kathy's heart swell with hope. Together he echoed his voice just above a whisper. They drove on in silence for a while longer, the road ahead uncertain, the darkness that followed them still looming. But in that moment, Kathy could feel the faintest glimmer of something, hope, a belief that no matter what the house had taken from them, they could still fight, and maybe, just maybe, they would win. But the storm hadn't passed. Not entirely. Kathy's gaze shifted to the rearview mirror again, a nagging feeling crawling up her spine. The road was empty, the world around them quiet, but she couldn't shake the sense of being watched. The house might have been behind them, but it was still there in them. She knew it. The darkness didn't let go so easily, and somewhere deep in the distance, she could have sworn she saw it again. the outline of the house, faint like a shadow creeping through the trees. A memory, a warning. The house wasn't done with them. The question was, would they ever be free? Kathy's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her eyes narrowing as she pushed forward. They wouldn't stop. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance. The road stretched on for what felt like hours, the landscape blurring in the headlights. The quiet was unnerving, a silence that felt too heavy, too thick. The storm had finally passed, but the air still hung with a tension that Kathy could feel in every fiber of her being. The world seemed to have returned to normal, or at least the illusion of normalcy. But the nagging sense of something just out of reach remained. The feeling that they were being watched, hunted, persisted in the back of Kathy's mind. Her eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something behind them. A shadow, a figure, the outline of the house. But there was nothing. Only the empty road, the dark stretch of pavement leading them further away from the place that had tried to destroy them. Yet the feeling still lingered. The house, or whatever force had tied them to it, wasn't finished. It wasn't ready to let them go. Kathy's grip on the steering wheel tightened, and she could feel George's eyes on her. She didn't need to look at him to know he was as disturbed as she was. She could feel it in the stillness between them, the air charged with an unspoken understanding. They both knew the truth. We're not free. Kathy whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the tires on the road. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, but it had slipped past her lips before she could stop herself. There was no denying it. The house, the thing that had been lurking inside it, had become a part of them. They could run. They could leave. But the darkness had followed them. The house had never really been a place. It had been something else, a force, a presence. And it had left its mark on all of them. George didn't respond immediately, his eyes still distant. But when he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost resigned. I know. Kathy's stomach tightened. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of their shared experience. The house had taken so much. It had broken them, twisted them, but they had survived. And that should have been enough. They had made it out. They were alive, but it wasn't enough. Not for Kathy. Not when she could feel the house still inside them, lurking just beneath the surface. I can still feel it, she said, her voice trembling as she spoke the truth she had been trying to deny. It's inside me. I feel it every time I close my eyes. It's like I can still hear it calling. George turned to her, then his expression one of quiet understanding. I know, Kathy. It's the same for me. She looked at him. Really. Looked at him for the first time in what felt like days. His eyes were haunted empty, but there was something more there too. A flicker of determination. He was still in there, she thought. Somewhere beneath the surface, her husband was still fighting. We've survived, George. Kathy said more to herself than to him. We've made it this far, and I won't let the house win. Not now. Not ever. George's lips curled into a faint, weary smile. We're still here, Kathy. We're still fighting. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the miles passing by in silence as they both wrestled with the weight of the truth. The storm had passed, but it felt like the calm before another one. The house might have lost this round, but it wasn't over. They hadn't seen the last of it. It had infected them, changed them. But Kathy wouldn't let it take them again, not without a fight. Hours passed, and the darkness of the road was replaced by the first hints of dawn, the pale light slowly creeping over the horizon. The world outside seemed calm, peaceful even. Birds began to chirp in the distance, the early morning light breaking through the trees. But inside the car, the air was thick with tension. the weight of their shared fear settling over them like a heavy blanket. And then out of nowhere, the car sputtered. The engine coughed once, twice, and then stalled. Kathy's breath hitched as she struggled to restart the car, her hands shaking as she turned the key. But nothing happened. The car was dead. Shit, Kathy muttered under her breath, trying again. The same result. The engine wouldn't turn over. Not now, she whispered, her heart racing as she looked around. The road was empty. There were no lights in the distance, no sign of civilization for miles. They were completely alone, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with only the endless stretch of road ahead. George shifted in his seat, his body stiff, his mind still caught somewhere far away. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice distant. "The car's broken," Kathy replied, trying to stay calm, though panic was beginning to bubble up inside her. She turned the key again, but the engine remained silent. "We're stuck." Kathy sat back in her seat, feeling the weight of the situation sink in. They had survived the house, but now they were stranded, isolated. They had nowhere to go, no one to help them. It was just the three of them, and the house. "We have to get out," Kathy said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know what else to do. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't. She looked at Missy, who had been eerily silent throughout the entire ordeal, her eyes staring out the window, lost in thought. She was distant, like a stranger in her own body. Kathy could feel her daughter's presence, but it was off. Something about her felt too quiet, too still. And it wasn't just the fear. There was something more. "Missy," Kathy called softly, but Missy didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, her body unmoving. Kathy's heart sank. Something was wrong. The house had changed her, yes, but now it felt like the house was still there, still lingering in Missy. Like the darkness had found another way to creep back in. "Missy," Kathy said, her voice rising in urgency. "Missy, look at me." Missy turned slowly, her eyes vacant, the same eerie, empty look in them that had been there before. But this time, it was different. Her lips parted, and what came out wasn't Missy's voice. It was the voice of the house. "You cannot escape. You belong to it now." Kathy's breath caught in her throat. The words were the same words they had heard in the house. The same voice. But it wasn't Missy. It wasn't her daughter. The house had never left. It had followed them. It had found them again. Kathy's heart stopped. She felt the weight of the darkness settling over them once more. The fight had never truly been over. And now the house was coming for them again. And this time it wasn't just George or Missy it wanted. It was all of them. The words, "You belong to it," now hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating the hope that had only just begun to take root inside Kathy's heart. She stared at Missy, her daughter's vacant eyes locked onto hers, the stillness of her body almost unnatural. It wasn't Missy speaking. It couldn't be. Kathy's mind raced. How could it still be here? They had left. They had driven away. They had escaped, or had they? The house had promised them they couldn't outrun it, but Kathy had refused to believe it. She had hoped, prayed that they were free, but the truth was undeniable now. It had followed them, and it was stronger than ever. Kathy's breath quickened as panic clawed at her chest. She had fought for so long, for so much. She had fought for George. She had fought for Missy. She had fought for their family. But this was something else. This wasn't just a house. This wasn't just a place. It was a force, a presence, something far older, far darker than she could have ever imagined. And it was inside her. It was inside them all. "Missy," Kathy whispered, her voice trembling. "Missy, please come back to me. Fight it. You're stronger than this. You're my daughter." But Missy's expression didn't change. She didn't blink. The red glow in her eyes flickered briefly, then vanished, replaced by the same vacant, eerie emptiness. The house was inside her again, consuming her from the inside out. And then the voice came again, cold, distant, in control. "You are mine," it said, sending a chill down Kathy's spine. "All of you. You cannot escape. You cannot run. You are a part of me now." Kathy could feel the grip of fear tightening around her heart. The house wasn't just an entity. It wasn't something they could outrun. It was alive, thriving on their fear, on their pain, on their weakness. And now it was using Missy again, just as it had used George, just as it had used the house itself to break them down, to pull them into its dark fold once more. But Kathy wouldn't let it. She couldn't. With every ounce of strength she had, she reached out to Missy, her hands trembling, her voice firm, despite the overwhelming terror she felt. Missy, fight. The air around them crackled like the tension before a storm, the oppressive weight of the house's presence pressing against Kathy's chest. She could feel the darkness clawing at her, wrapping around her like a chain trying to pull her down. The whispers, the cold, the feeling of being watched, it all pressed against her. But Kathy refused to give in. She turned to George, her eyes desperate. "George," she said, her voice breaking, "we can't let it take her. Please, you have to help me." George, who had been sitting motionless beside her, turned his head slowly toward her. His eyes empty. Lost finally seemed to focus on her, but there was no recognition. The house had already taken him, and Kathy knew it. He wasn't the man she loved anymore. He wasn't her George. "I'm sorry," Kathy. George said, his voice low and hollow, his eyes dark. "We can't fight this. We never could." Kathy felt the weight of his words like a physical blow. She had fought so hard to bring him back, to bring them back. But the house wasn't done. Not with him. Not with Missy. And not with her. The car began to shake as the house's presence grew stronger, the air thickening with a sense of dread that was almost suffocating. The darkness pressed against Kathy like a wave crashing down on her, threatening to pull her under. She gasped for breath, struggling against the pressure, her mind racing. "No," she whispered to herself, her voice steady, despite the fear that rose within her. "I won't let you win. Not like this. We're stronger than you." Kathy looked at George again, her heart heavy with the realization that she couldn't save him, not in the way she had hoped, but there was still a chance. She couldn't give up on Missy. She couldn't. Not again. Kathy reached for Missy, her hands trembling as she grasped her daughter's shoulders. "Missy," she said, her voice shaking with both fear and love. "Please, I need you to hear me. You're still in there. You're still my daughter. You have to fight this. You have to come back." For a moment, the shadows around them seemed to recede. The air felt lighter, the storm outside a distant memory. Kathy felt a flicker of something real, deep within Missy's eyes, something that wasn't the house. It was her. It was the girl Kathy had fought so hard to protect, the girl who had been taken from her so many times, but who was still worth saving. Missy's body trembled beneath Kathy's hands, her breath shallow, her lips parted as if she were struggling to speak. And then the darkness seemed to retreat just a little. "Mom," Missy whispered, her voice weak but hers. "Mom." "I'm scared." Kathy's heart soared with relief, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. "I know, sweetheart. I know. But we're going to make it. We'll get through this. Together." Kathy held Missy tighter, the light from her heart growing brighter, pushing back against the shadows that had once consumed them. The darkness still tried to fight, still tried to pull them back into the cold grip of the house. But Kathy refused to let go. She wouldn't let it take them again. The wind howled outside the storm, battering the car, but the world inside felt different. Kathy felt something break within her, the last of the fear shattering like glass. She could feel the strength inside her, the love she had for her family, burning brighter than the darkness. The car shook again, but this time, it wasn't the house. It was the force of her own will, the power of love and determination, pushing back against the dark. The house had taken so much from them, but Kathy wouldn't let it take anything else. Not Missy, not George, not herself. "We're not done," Kathy said, her voice steady and resolute. "We're going to make it, together. We're stronger than this." The shadows around them began to recede, the air clearing, the pressure lifting. The house was screaming, but Kathy couldn't hear it anymore. The power that had once consumed them was fading, slipping away its grip, loosening its presence, weakening. And then there was only silence. The storm outside had passed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Kathy could breathe. They were free, but Kathy knew the truth. The darkness had never truly been gone. The house would always be there, lurking just beyond the edges of their lives, waiting for the right moment to strike. But as long as they stayed together, as long as they fought, it could never win. They had survived, and together they would keep fighting. The silence in the car was all-encompassing. The storm had faded into the distance, and the world outside was slowly transitioning from the oppressive weight of the night to the soft, gentle light of dawn. Kathy could feel the tension in the air like the calm before another storm, but she didn't want to think about that. Not yet. Not after everything they had just been through. The car, though still idling, felt strangely still. Missy had fallen silent again, but this time there was a sense of peace in her, something that had been missing for so long. Kathy kept glancing at her daughter, watching the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she slept. Her face, though tired, seemed more relaxed. She wasn't trapped anymore, not like before. Kathy turned her gaze to George, who was still staring blankly out the window. He hadn't spoken in what seemed like hours, his expression distant, his body stiff. But there was something different in him now, a flicker of something behind the fog that had once consumed him. His eyes, though weary, seemed more present, more aware. It wasn't the same emptiness she had seen earlier. Maybe there was still a piece of him left. "We're okay," Kathy whispered more to herself than to anyone else. She wasn't entirely sure if she believed the words yet, but she had to say them. They had to believe it. But as she said it, she realized that it wasn't over. The house, the force that had been controlling them, had been driven back for now. But Kathy could still feel its presence lingering just beyond the edge of her perception. The house might have been silent for the moment, but it wasn't gone. It had never been just a house. It was a part of them woven into their souls. It had left its mark, and that mark would never fade. Kathy shook her head, forcing herself to push away the thoughts that tried to creep in. She couldn't afford to think that way. Not right now. They were together. They were alive. And that was enough. Her fingers curled around the steering wheel as she glanced at the road ahead. They needed to keep moving, but where could they go? They had no real destination, no safe place to run to. The road stretched on endlessly, the horizon barely visible through the misty morning haze. She could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. What now? George's voice broke the silence, his tone low, almost inaudible, but there was something there, something more than the emptiness he had been carrying. Kathy turned to him, her heart aching. "We keep going," she said, her voice steady, but the uncertainty in her words was obvious. "We can't go back. We can't let it win." George looked at her, then really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time in ages. The weight in his eyes softened just for a moment, and for the briefest second, Kathy saw the man she had loved, the man who had once been strong and whole. He nodded, though it was a slow, almost reluctant gesture. "Where do we go?" George asked, his voice thick with the remnants of the house's influence. "Where can we go that it won't find us?" Kathy didn't have an answer. There was no place left to run. The house had followed them, had reached out and claimed them, and no matter how far they drove, no matter how fast they ran, it felt like the house would always be there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for them to let their guard down. "We keep moving," Kathy said again, her voice stronger this time. "We don't stop. We don't give up." Missy shifted in the back seat, her eyes flickering open, her small face still drawn with the shadows of the ordeal they had been through. Kathy glanced at her, meeting her daughter's tired gaze in the rearview mirror. "Are you okay?" Kathy asked gently. Missy nodded, her lips pressing into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Kathy could see the flicker of the girl she had fought for, the girl who had once been full of life buried beneath the weight of everything that had happened. But she was there. She was still there. "We'll be okay," Kathy whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure if she believed it. But she had to say it. They had to believe it. If they didn't, they would be lost forever. She turned her attention back to the road, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. They had no destination, no real plan. But that didn't matter now. They couldn't outrun the house. They couldn't outrun the darkness that had infected their lives. But they could keep moving forward. They could keep fighting day by day until the shadows no longer had a hold on them. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to live again. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was the only path left. The house had tried to destroy them. It had nearly taken everything. But Kathy refused to let it. She refused to let the darkness win. They would keep moving, and this time the house would never take them again. The car continued down the road, the miles passing by in eerie silence. But as they drove, Kathy felt the first true sense of relief she had felt in so long. They were alive, together, and whatever came next, whatever lay ahead, they would face it as a family. And that was enough. For now, the sun had risen fully now, casting a soft, golden light over the road ahead. The storm had passed, but Kathy couldn't shake the feeling of dread that still clung to her. It wasn't the thunder or the rain that had been their enemy. It was the house that had never truly left them. The car's tires hummed steadily against the wet asphalt, the only sound filling the otherwise silent car. Kathy kept her eyes on the road, but every so often she would glance at George, who was sitting beside her, his eyes still distant, like he was somewhere far away. Kathy knew he was fighting it. She could feel it in the tension in his body, the way his jaw tightened whenever he glanced toward the rearview mirror, as if expecting something or someone to appear behind them. And then there was Missy. She had gone quiet again. After her faint smile, her eyes had lost focus, and she seemed lost in thought, staring out the window, her body slack and unresponsive. Kathy knew she was fighting the pull of the house, too. The darkness had twisted them all, but Missy's struggle felt different. Kathy could feel that her daughter was slipping further away, her body physically present, but her spirit hanging on by a thread. Kathy's grip tightened on the wheel. She had to protect them. She couldn't lose them again. Not after everything they had been through. "We need to stop," George said suddenly, his voice startling Kathy from her thoughts. She turned to him, surprised. "We can't keep driving forever. We have to face it." Kathy swallowed her throat tight. Face what she asked, though she already knew the answer. The house. It's inside us. We can't outrun it. We can't escape it. It's still here. His voice broke, and Kathy's heart tightened at the vulnerability she hadn't heard in his tone in so long. I feel it, Kathy. I know it's not gone. Kathy hesitated. The truth of his words settled in like a heavy weight. They couldn't outrun the darkness. It was a part of them now. She could feel it in every breath, every flicker of unease. No matter how far they drove, no matter how much distance they put between themselves and the house, it would always find them. It would never truly let them go. We can't just stop, George Kathy said quietly, her voice shaking. Where would we even go? The house, it isn't a place. It's something else. Something that follows. Then we fight it. George said, his eyes turning to meet hers, his gaze hardening. We fight it. Together. If we don't, we're just running forever. Kathy looked at him for a long moment. His face was drawn, the toll of their experiences etched into his features. But there was something in his eyes now, a glimmer of the man he had once been, a spark of resolve that had been missing for so long. I'm not running anymore either, Kathy whispered. But we have to know what we're fighting. We have to understand it before we can beat it. The car slowed as they passed a small, nondescript town, the streets quiet in the early morning light. Kathy's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again. There was nothing there. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them just beyond the horizon, waiting. Let's stop here, Kathy said, her voice steady. Maybe we can find someone who can help us. Maybe there's someone who knows what this thing is. George nodded silently, his gaze never leaving the road ahead. If there's anyone left who knows anything, he murmured. Kathy pulled the car into a small parking lot in front of an old diner. The neon sign above flickered weakly, casting an eerie, broken light over the empty street. The town felt abandoned, like a forgotten place. The air smelled stale, and Kathy felt a growing unease, but she pushed it aside. They had no other choice. She turned off the engine, the sudden quiet in the car making her feel even more alone. Missy hadn't moved. She was still staring blankly out the window, her expression vacant. Kathy's heart broke for her daughter, knowing that whatever had been done to her, it was still there, hidden behind her eyes. We'll be okay, Kathy said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. She got out of the car, the cool morning air hitting her face like a slap. She walked around to the other side of the car, opening Missy's door. Her daughter didn't respond as Kathy gently shook her. Come on, sweetie. We have to go inside. We can't stay in here. Missy slowly turned her head to Kathy, her eyes vacant. But this time there was a flicker of something recognition before the emptiness settled back in. Come on, Missy, Kathy urged, taking her daughter's hand and helping her out of the car. Missy's body was limp, her legs unsteady, as if she hadn't moved in days. Kathy kept her hand on her daughter's back as they walked toward the diner's entrance. She could feel the weight of the moment settling over her like a heavy cloak. They weren't just fighting the house anymore. They were fighting the darkness that had consumed their family. And Kathy knew deep down that the battle was far from over. The door to the diner creaked as they entered. It was a small, dimly lit space with only a few people sitting at the counter nursing cups of coffee. The air smelled of stale coffee and old leather. A middle-aged woman behind the counter looked up as they walked in, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. Kathy's eyes scanned the room quickly, but there was no one who looked like they had any answers. Can I help you? The woman asked, her voice flat but polite. Kathy cleared her throat, unsure of how to even begin. We need help, she said, her voice faltering. We've been running from something, and we don't know where else to go. The woman studied them for a moment, her gaze shifting between Kathy, George, and Missy. Kathy could feel the woman's scrutiny, her unease growing. It wasn't a welcoming gaze. It was something deeper, something more knowing. "You should leave," the woman said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Now, Kathy's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" The woman leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "There are things out there, things that don't stop, and you'll never outrun them. Not if you keep running." The words hung in the air between them, thick with a meaning Kathy couldn't fully grasp. Then, "What do we do?" Kathy asked, her voice cracking. She had no idea what the woman meant, but she knew that whatever she was saying, it was real. It was true. She could feel it. The house, the thing, was still coming for them. The woman looked at her with something close to pity, then nodded slowly. "You have to face it, or it will keep following you." The woman's words hit Kathy like a punch to the gut. They couldn't keep running. Not anymore. "We can't stop," Kathy whispered more to herself than to anyone else. "We can't keep running." The woman's eyes softened, but there was no kindness in them, only understanding. And that understanding chilled Kathy to her bones. "Then you better be ready to fight," the woman said quietly, her voice darkening with finality. "Because it won't stop. Not until it's taken everything." Kathy stood there frozen as the weight of the woman's words settled deep into her soul. The house wasn't done. It had never been finished with them. Kathy stood in the dimly lit diner, her heart racing as the woman's words echoed in her mind. "You better be ready to fight." The words had landed with the force of a thunderclap, reverberating in her chest, settling deep in her bones. There was no running anymore, no more hiding. The house, the darkness, it would always find them, always be there, until they fought back. And Kathy had no idea how to even begin. She turned to George, his face pale and distant as he stood by the table staring at the floor. She could see the weight of it in him, the burden of what they had lived through. It was on all of them, this horrible, invisible force that had latched itself onto their lives. "We have to stop running," Kathy said softly, her voice cracking. She hated the feeling in her chest, the one that told her that she might not be able to win. "But how? How do we even fight something like this?" George met her gaze, then his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else, resignation. "I don't know," he whispered. "But I'm tired, Kathy. I'm so tired of this. Running. We can't keep doing this. We can't keep losing." Kathy nodded, though she wasn't sure she agreed. Part of her wanted to believe that they could somehow outrun the darkness, that they could find safety somewhere, anywhere. But she knew the truth. There was no running from it. The house, the thing, wasn't bound to a place. It had no limits, no rules. It was a part of them now. Missy. Kathy looked over her shoulder, and her heart sank as she saw her daughter slumped against the counter. Missy hadn't moved since they entered the diner. Her eyes were dull again, distant. Kathy could still feel the pull of the house around her, threading through Missy like an invisible tether dragging her away. Kathy walked over to Missy, her heart aching at the sight of her. She crouched down beside her daughter, gently touching her arm. "Missy," Kathy whispered softly. "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" Missy's eyes flickered, but there was nothing there. She wasn't really there. The darkness still held her, held them all. Kathy could feel the pull of it, the grip it had on her family, and the realization hit her like a flood. They couldn't fight it the way they thought they could. The house had never been just a house. It had never been just a place of terror. It was a force, something that thrived on fear, on pain. Something that would follow them always until they understood it. And in order to stop it, they needed to understand what it was. The diner's clock ticked softly in the background, the minutes slipping away. But for Kathy, the seconds felt like hours. The woman behind the counter was watching them closely, her eyes sharp, her expression unreadable. Kathy didn't know what to make of her. There was something about her, something unsettling in the way she spoke. It was as though she knew exactly what they were facing, like she had seen it before. Kathy turned to the woman, her voice trembling with both desperation and uncertainty. "How do we fight it?" She asked, her words quiet but filled with a fierce need. "How do we stop it?" "You must know something." The woman's gaze didn't waver. She was silent for a long moment before finally answering, her voice low and steady. "The house isn't the problem. It's the thing inside it. The thing that makes it alive. It's not just a building. It's a doorway. And as long as you're still alive, as long as you're still connected to it, it will always find you." Kathy's breath caught in her throat. The thing inside it. She had known deep down that it wasn't just the house. It never was. But hearing it spoken aloud made the reality of it feel even more suffocating. The woman's eyes softened, but there was no kindness in her expression. Only knowing. "You can't run forever," she said, "and you can't fight it head on, not until you understand what it really is. The house feeds on fear, on regret, on guilt. It warps your emotions, your very mind. It makes you think you're safe, then it pulls you back in." Kathy stepped back, her mind reeling. The words spun in her head, and she could feel a sense of dread growing not from the house itself, but from the truth. They had always been running from it, trying to outrun its grip, but it had always been inside them. It had taken root in their minds, in their hearts, in their very souls. It had been feeding off them from the very beginning. "Then what do we do?" Kathy asked, her voice hoarse. The woman looked at her with dark, knowing eyes. "You have to confront it. You have to go back to where it all began." Kathy froze. The woman's words hit her like a bolt of lightning. "Go back," she repeated, her voice trembling. "But we can't. We can't go back to that place. We left it. We escaped. Escape isn't enough," the woman replied simply. "You have to face it. If you ever hope to break its hold, you have to return to the source. Only then will you understand what it really is. Only then will you be able to break free." Kathy's heart sank as the weight of her words settled in. Go back to the house, to the place that had torn her family apart. It felt like a death sentence, but deep down, she knew there was no other choice. The house wasn't going to stop until they returned to it. "I can't," Kathy whispered. "I can't go back there. I can't put Missy through that again." The woman's expression softened, but her voice remained firm. "It's not just about you. It's about your family. You've all been changed. You can't just run from it anymore. The house has already marked you, and it won't stop until it's consumed everything." Kathy's mind spun. She couldn't go back. She couldn't subject her family to that place again. But as the woman's words echoed in her mind, she knew she had no choice. The house wasn't finished with them. "If we go back," Kathy said, her voice barely above a whisper, "will it end?" The woman looked at her, and for the first time Kathy saw something close to pity in her eyes. "No. But you might survive. You might find the strength to break it. But only if you confront the source. Only if you face the thing that controls it all." The weight of her words settled like an anchor in Kathy's chest. They couldn't outrun it. They couldn't hide. The house had always been a part of them, and until they faced it again, until they confronted the darkness inside it, they would never truly be free. Kathy turned to George and Missy, their faces pale and worn, but there was a flicker of determination in their eyes now, the same flicker she had seen in George's gaze earlier. They knew it too. They couldn't keep running. They had to face what had nearly destroyed them. The woman's voice cut through the silence again. You'll have to leave soon, before the house finds you again." Kathy nodded, her resolve hardening. They had survived. They had fought. And now it was time to face the darkness once and for all. Kathy stood still, her mind racing as the woman's words echoed in her head. "You have to go back to the source." The house wasn't finished with them yet. The house had never been finished with them. The thought twisted in her stomach like a live wire, but there was no denying it. She had to return. They had to face the place that had almost torn them apart. The road ahead wasn't just a physical journey. It was a journey into the heart of the darkness, a place Kathy hadn't dared revisit since they left. It felt like a cruel joke, a nightmare they couldn't escape. But the house, whatever it was, had followed them this far. It had already marked them, scarred them in ways they couldn't even begin to understand. But now the words of the woman at the diner cut through the confusion. She had said it clearly. You can't outrun it. Not until you face it. "Mom?" Missy's voice broke through Kathy's thoughts. The softness in her tone made Kathy look up, and she found her daughter's gaze fixed on her. Missy's face was pale, the weight of their shared trauma hanging in the air between them. But there was something else in her eyes, a flicker of recognition. The light was still there. Kathy kneeled beside her, her voice barely a whisper. "Sweetheart, are you okay? Are you with me?" Missy nodded, but it was slow, hesitant. The darkness that had haunted her was still lingering beneath the surface. Kathy reached out, brushing a lock of wet hair from Missy's face, the familiar warmth of her touch, a small comfort in the midst of the storm they had yet to face. "We have to go back," Kathy said, her voice filled with both determination and fear. "We have to face it. The house. It's not finished with us, but we're stronger than it. We can do this." George, who had been silent for so long, finally spoke up. His voice was hoarse, broken, but there was something raw and real in it now, something that hadn't been there before. "I don't want to go back," he muttered, his eyes staring at the floor of the diner. His shoulders slumped under the weight of everything they had gone through. "I thought we were done. I thought we escaped." Kathy felt the same ache in her heart. They had escaped once. They had run and they had survived. But now they were being called back to the very thing they feared most. "I know, George," Kathy said softly, her hand resting on his. "But if we don't face it now, we'll never be free. We'll always be running. We can't let it control us anymore." George was silent for a long moment, the weight of Kathy's words pressing down on him. But then he nodded, his expression hardening with a resolve that matched Kathy's own. "You're right. We can't keep running." They all stood together in that quiet, haunted diner, the storm outside still rumbling in the distance. Kathy's heart raced, but she felt something else too, a small, flickering flame of hope. They hadn't been defeated. Not yet. The woman behind the counter gave them a solemn nod as they stood to leave, her eyes sharp, but there was something almost kind in them now. She knew what they had to face. She knew the road ahead was not easy, but she also knew they were not as helpless as they had been when they first stepped into the house. "Good luck," she said simply, her voice almost a prayer. Kathy didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded and turned toward the door. She wasn't sure where the road would lead them. The house would always be there, lingering in the corners of their lives, but this time, Kathy would not allow it to take them. This time, they would face it together. They left the diner and walked back to the car, the morning light now fully breaking through the clouds. The world outside seemed normal, too normal. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the storm that had torn apart their lives was nothing more than a distant memory. But Kathy knew better. The house was never just a storm. It was a presence, and it had followed them here. She started the car, the engine roaring to life, and they began their journey once again. Kathy's grip tightened on the wheel as they drove away from the small town, the road stretching out ahead of them. The house was still there, somewhere waiting for them to return. But they would face it. They had no other choice. The silence in the car was almost deafening, but it was different this time. They weren't just running anymore. They were going back. To face the thing that had taken so much. To face the thing that had marked them all, the house. It had never really left them, but now they were going to take it down. The road ahead seemed endless, but it was their only path. Kathy knew the fight was just beginning, but she also knew that she had her family by her side, and for the first time she believed that maybe, just maybe, they would survive. The road stretched on an endless ribbon of asphalt that seemed to vanish into the horizon. The sun had risen fully now, but the day still felt heavy, as though the very atmosphere was thick with tension. Kathy's fingers gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The house, the nightmare they had lived through, was still calling them back. It was a force, a presence, something far bigger than any one person, any single place. And now they were headed straight toward it. George sat quietly beside her, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but Kathy could feel the unease radiating from him. It had never been just about the house. It had been about them, about everything the house had taken, everything it had warped. George had fought so hard to come back to her, but she could see the scars on him. The house had left its mark, just as it had on Missy, just as it had on Kathy. They were all changed. Missy was still quiet in the back seat. Kathy kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Her daughter's face was pale, her eyes glassy, and though she was awake, she seemed lost. Kathy's heart ached with the sight of her. Missy had fought the darkness before, but this time it felt like the battle was harder. Missy was older, and the house had taken so much more from her. The light that had flickered in her eyes had dimmed again, and Kathy couldn't tell if it was the house that was winning, or if it was the exhaustion of having lived through so much terror. The minutes turned into hours, the car rumbling down the road, the silence in the car thickening with every mile. The distance between them and the house was growing smaller, but Kathy couldn't help but feel like the house was already inside them. It was waiting. It had always been waiting. "We're almost there," Kathy said softly, breaking the silence, but her words felt hollow, as if they didn't mean anything anymore. She glanced at George. "Are you ready?" George didn't answer right away, his eyes still focused on the road, but Kathy saw his jaw tighten, his hands trembling slightly on his lap. He hadn't said much since they left the diner, and Kathy could see the strain on his face. He had been through so much, and yet there was still a flicker of hope in him. She saw it when he looked at Missy. He wanted to believe that they could defeat the house, that they could finally be free of it. But Kathy wasn't sure they could. Not this time. "We don't have a choice," George said, his voice hoarse. "We've always been running from it. We can't run anymore. If we want any chance of getting out, we have to face it. Together." Kathy's chest tightened. She knew what George was saying. She knew it too. They couldn't keep running. But the thought of returning to that place, the house that had stolen their family, the place where they had nearly lost everything, felt like a death sentence. Every part of her screamed to turn the car around, to find a place to hide, to go anywhere but there. But they couldn't. Together, Kathy whispered, her voice barely audible, but it was enough to bring a measure of comfort. Together. They were in this together. And maybe that was the only way they would survive. The car slowed as they neared the familiar road that would lead them to the house. Kathy's pulse quickened, her body tensing. as they passed the last intersection, the town slipping away behind them. The trees grew thicker, the air colder. The house was close now, and Kathy could feel it. It was in the air. It was in her blood. The house hadn't just taken their home, it had taken them. Missy shifted in the back seat, her eyes wide, still locked on the horizon. She hadn't said a word since they left the diner, but Kathy could feel her daughter's presence. The fight was still inside her. Kathy knew it. They had to hold on. They had to fight. She wasn't going to lose her again. Not like before. And then she saw it. The house. It loomed in the distance, standing tall against the backdrop of the storm-darkened sky. It was there, but it wasn't just the house. The house was more than that. It was alive. The same ominous presence that had haunted them all these months seemed to radiate from it. Its windows dark and empty, the roof sagging under the weight of its own history. The closer they got, the more Kathy could feel it. Its cold grip wrapping around her chest, squeezing her heart, pulling her deeper into its hold. Her breath caught in her throat, her hands trembling as she gripped the wheel tighter. The car rolled slowly toward the front gates of the house, but Kathy couldn't bring herself to stop. She couldn't bring herself to turn away. They had to do this. They had no other choice. The car rolled to a stop at the gates. The house stretched before them, dark and oppressive, the ground around it eerily still. For a moment, the only sound was the wind howling through the trees, the distant rumble of thunder still hanging in the air. "We're here," Kathy whispered the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. George shifted beside her, his hand reaching for the door handle. "We don't have to do this alone," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "We have each other, and that's enough. We will fight this. Together." Kathy took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything they had gone through, the pain, the fear, the loss, but also the love. The love that had always been there, pulling them through the darkest moments. "You're right," Kathy said, her voice steady now, her determination rising. "We are together." With that, she opened the door and stepped out into the rain-soaked yard, her shoes sinking into the soft earth. She looked back at the car where George and Missy were stepping out as well, their faces pale but resolute. The house stood before them, like a living, breathing thing, waiting for them to step into its darkness once more. They walked forward, their steps in sync, the wind howling around them. They didn't know what would happen next, but they knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't be consumed by this house. Not this time. They would face it, together. And no matter what the house threw at them, they would survive. The rain had picked up again, the cold droplets stinging Kathy's skin as she stepped forward, her boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground. The wind howled around them, almost as if the house itself were breathing its very presence, shifting the air with a chilling force. Kathy's heart raced as she walked, her steps steady but heavy, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on her with every step. George and Missy followed closely behind her. Missy was silent, her face blank, but Kathy could feel her presence. She could feel the struggle inside her daughter, the fight still there, buried beneath the weight of the darkness. George, too, was fighting, though he seemed lost in the shadows of his own mind. But Kathy would not let him slip away again. Not like before. She couldn't lose him again. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the darkened sky. The windows were dark, like empty eyes, staring down at them, waiting for them to come closer. There was something almost alive about it, something that made Kathy's stomach churn. It wasn't just a house. It was a predator feeding off their fear, their pain. And it was hungry. Kathy stopped just short of the front door, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She could feel the pull, the pressure, the suffocating force that came from the house. It was calling to them. It had always been calling to them. But this time, Kathy wasn't afraid. She turned to George, her hand reaching out for his. He looked at her, his eyes distant at first, but when their hands touched, something shifted. A spark of something familiarity flickered in his eyes. His grip tightened around her hand, and for a moment, Kathy felt the old connection between them, the bond that had never truly broken. They were still here. They were still fighting. "We do this together," Kathy whispered, her voice steady now, the words carrying a weight of their own. "We can't let it take us." George nodded, the same quiet determination settling over him. The shadows that had clung to him seemed to shift, but they didn't overpower him. Not this time. Kathy turned to Missy. Her daughter's eyes were fixed on the door, her body tense, her shoulders hunched, as if she were trying to brace herself for what lay beyond. The fear was there, but so was the quiet strength. Missy had fought the darkness before, and she would fight it again. "Missy," Kathy said softly, her voice warm despite the fear clawing at her chest. "We're not going to let it take you. We're all in this together." For the first time in what felt like forever, Missy looked at her. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a brief moment of connection that made Kathy's heart swell. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Her daughter was still there fighting. Missy nodded slowly, her lips pressing together in a faint, determined line. Kathy reached out, pulling her into a brief embrace. It was quick, but it was all they had together, holding on to the bond that had survived everything the house had thrown at them. Kathy's breath caught in her throat as she turned back to the door. She could feel the weight of the house pressing against her, trying to pull her in. But this time she wasn't afraid. This time, she was ready. She reached for the doorknob. It was cold, slick with the rain. But it didn't matter. She twisted it, pushing the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. The air inside was thick with the same oppressive weight that had once filled every inch of the house. The darkness seemed to pour out of the door, the shadows swirling around her like a living thing trying to pull her in. But Kathy stepped forward, forcing herself into the house. She could feel the pressure against her chest, the suffocating presence of the house, but she pushed through it. She wouldn't let it win. She wouldn't let it take them. Behind her, George and Missy followed. The house had already tried to tear them apart, but it hadn't succeeded, and it wouldn't succeed now. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked under their feet, as though the house itself were reacting to their presence, reacting to their defiance. The shadows shifted, warping around them, whispering things Kathy couldn't understand. Things she didn't need to understand. The house was alive, but it wasn't in control anymore. She was. "Stay close," Kathy whispered, though she didn't need to say it. They knew. They had fought this battle before, and now they were going to win. They moved through the house, the hallway stretching out in front of them, dark and oppressive. The air felt thick, heavy, with the weight of everything that had happened here. Everything that had been taken. But Kathy wouldn't stop. She wouldn't let the house break them again. They reached the staircase, the same staircase they had ascended all those months ago when everything had gone wrong. The memories rushed back in an overwhelming wave, but Kathy shoved them aside. She couldn't think about what had happened. She couldn't think about the pain. Not now. They had to move forward. Kathy placed her hand on the first step. The house shuddered as though it were waking up, and the air crackled with the malevolent energy that had always been there. The shadows at the top of the stairs seemed to pulse, as though someone was waiting for them. But Kathy didn't hesitate. She took the first step, and then another, and another. George and Missy followed their footsteps, echoing in the silence. With each step, Kathy could feel the house's hold, weakening the shadows, retreating, just a little. The air felt less suffocating, less oppressive. They weren't running anymore. They were taking control. They reached the top of the stairs, and Kathy felt the temperature drop. The door to the room, the one they had been so afraid to enter, was just ahead. The house was still fighting, but it was losing. It could feel their resolve. It could feel their determination. Kathy reached for the door handle, but before she could turn it, she heard a sound, a soft scraping noise, like nails against wood. Her heart skipped a beat. The shadows at the door shifted, and Kathy felt the air grow cold, icy. A voice, low guttural, rose from the darkness. "You can't escape. You will never escape." The house was fighting back. But this time, Kathy was ready. She twisted the doorknob and threw the door open. The room beyond was dark, but Kathy could see someone standing in the center. The figure was tall, hunched, its form cloaked in shadows. But Kathy knew what it was. The house. It was here, and it was ready for one final battle. The door creaked open, slowly revealing the room beyond. The air felt colder now, like stepping into the very heart of the house where the darkness was thick enough to taste. The shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting with a life of their own, swirling around the edges of the room as if they were waiting for them to step in, waiting for them to fall prey to the house's final grasp. Kathy's breath caught in her throat as she looked into the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Standing in the center, bathed in a flickering, ghostly light, was the figure. Tall, hunched its form, distorted by the shadows. The thing that had been there from the beginning. The thing that had ruined them. That had been behind the whispers, the fears, the terrors that had tormented them since they arrived. But this time, Kathy didn't flinch. This time, she wasn't afraid. "We're not afraid of you anymore," Kathy said, her voice steady, her heart thundering in her chest. She stepped forward into the room, the door creaking shut behind her. The presence of the house seemed to swell around them, suffocating, but Kathy stood firm. The figure's head tilted to one side as though considering her words. The shadows twisted in a slow, mocking motion, as if the house were studying her, trying to gauge her resolve. "You think you can defy me?" The voice came cold and thick, reverberating through the walls, curling around Kathy like an icy breath. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and the floor groaned beneath its weight. Kathy didn't move. She wouldn't. "We're done running," she said, her voice fierce now, stronger than it had ever been. "You won't take us again. Not this time. Not ever again." The figure's laugh echoed through the room, low and deep, a sound that seemed to crawl up her spine. "You're so sure of yourselves, but you still don't understand. You can never escape me. You were always meant to be part of me. You always will be." Kathy could feel the weight of its words, the force of them pressing against her. But she refused to let it break her. She had fought too long, too hard to let the house claim them again. She turned to George and Missy, both standing behind her. George's face was tense, his eyes shadowed, but there was a flicker of something alive in them. He had always been her anchor. He still was. He hadn't given in, and he wouldn't now. Missy's eyes were wide, her body rigid, but there was something else there too. A flicker of strength. The same strength that had once pulled her from the grip of the darkness. She wasn't lost. Not yet. Not if Kathy had anything to say about it. "We are not yours," Kathy said, her voice louder now, more forceful. She could feel the power surging inside her, the light from deep within, stronger than the darkness surrounding them. "You don't control us anymore." The figure's face twisted, the shadows in the room flickering with an almost malicious glee. "You think you can defeat me? You can't even see the real me. You're blind to what's been feeding off you for so long." A surge of cold swept over them, making Kathy's skin crawl, but she stood her ground. She wouldn't back down. "Not now. This ends tonight," she said, her voice cutting through the thick darkness. We break free of you. We will break the hold you have over us. The figure's expression changed, the glee fading into something far darker. You think you can break me, break us. The voice echoed now, filled with a cruel finality. I am inside you. I am a part of you. You cannot escape me. But Kathy wasn't listening anymore. She had heard the house's lies too many times. She had felt its grasp too many times. It had been feeding on their fear, their pain, their regrets, but no more. The house couldn't feed on them anymore. Not if they fought together. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the light inside her build. The house's presence, the pressure, the dark force that had been weighing on her for so long was still there. But now it felt weaker. It couldn't control her anymore. She could feel it deep in her bones. The house had fed off their fear, but Kathy wasn't afraid anymore. The darkness had no power over them unless they let it, and they weren't going to let it. She opened her eyes, and this time when she spoke, her voice was stronger than ever. No more. The house screamed in fury. The walls rattled, the floor groaned, but Kathy didn't falter. She reached out for George's hand, her grip firm, and then for Missy's, pulling them both close. The light inside her flared, and for the first time, Kathy felt the darkness recoil, retreating like a shadow at sunrise. The figure's eyes widened in surprise, as if it had never encountered resistance like this. The shadows seemed to writhe and scream, but Kathy could feel their power diminishing. They were pushing back. They were fighting. You will never have us. Kathy said, her voice filled with both defiance and love. We are stronger than you. The room around them began to shake, the very foundation of the house, groaning as though it were being torn apart. The figure, which had once seemed so powerful, now seemed to shrink in the light of their determination. The darkness clawed at them, trying to pull them back. But Kathy and her family stood firm, their hearts intertwined in a bond the house couldn't break. The light from Kathy's heart surged brighter now, flooding the room, driving back the shadows until the house itself seemed to howl in agony. The walls cracked, the floor splintered, and with a final deafening scream, the figure shrank into nothingness, swallowed by the very darkness it had once controlled. For a moment the world held its breath, then silence. The air grew still. The pressure lifted. The house, the thing, was gone. Not destroyed, but gone. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Kathy could breathe. She could feel the weight of the past. The house, the fear, the torment lift from her chest. Kathy turned to George and Missy, their faces pale but filled with the same relief she felt. They had done it. Together they had faced the darkness, and they had won. We're free, Kathy whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Missy looked at her, her eyes no longer clouded with darkness. We're really free, she asked, her voice small but hopeful. We're free. Kathy confirmed, her heart swelling with love and relief. They had made it through. They had defeated the darkness that had tried to tear them apart. And they were still standing. For the first time in so long, Kathy felt the weight of the past finally lifting, as though the chains that had bound them were breaking away. The house was gone, the darkness receding. And now they could begin again. But Kathy knew one thing for sure: no matter what came next, no matter what life threw at them, they would face it together. Because they were stronger than anything the house had ever thrown at them. And together, they would survive. The silence in the room was heavy, but it wasn't oppressive. It was the silence of something finished. The house, the thing that had tormented them for so long, had fallen silent. The world outside, once cold and suffocating, now seemed to breathe easier, as though the air itself had been cleared. Kathy's hands trembled as she slowly released the grip on George and Missy. Her heart was still pounding, the adrenaline of the fight surging through her, but the deep relief that followed was undeniable. The house, the darkness, was no longer a threat. Not today. And maybe, just maybe, they had taken back the power it had stolen from them. The room around them seemed to shift. The walls, once so oppressive, now felt like they were just walls again, aged and worn, but not threatening. They were not the walls of the house. They were just the walls of a home. Kathy could feel the weight of everything they had endured starting to sink in, but the hope, real, tangible hope, was there. It was in the way the light felt warmer now, in the way the shadows seemed to be retreating into the corners. "We really did it," George said quietly, his voice hoarse but filled with something Kathy hadn't heard from him in a long time. Relief. Kathy turned to look at him. There was a flicker of the man she had loved, the man who had been consumed by the darkness, but now he was back. The remnants of the house, the poison it had filled him with, had been expelled. They were standing on the other side of it together. "We did," Kathy whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She reached out to take his hand, squeezing it tightly. "We made it." George nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Together, he repeated. It was the word that had anchored them through this entire nightmare, the word that had given them strength. Missy, still standing beside them, her eyes clear, for the first time in ages, finally spoke. I thought it was going to take us again," she said softly, her voice uncertain. "But you didn't let it. You never let it." Kathy felt a wave of emotion crash over her at her daughter's words. She pulled Missy into her arms, holding her tight the way she had so many times before. But this time, it wasn't fear. It wasn't desperation. It was love. Pure and simple. "We're free, sweetheart," Kathy whispered. "It's over. You're safe." For the first time, Kathy felt the weight of the years of fear, of pain, of loss begin to lift. The house hadn't just been a physical structure. It had been an anchor to something darker. But now they were no longer bound to it. They had taken their lives back. And though the road ahead would not be without its challenges, they would face it together. Missy pulled back, wiping away the tears that had gathered in her eyes. She looked up at her mother, her expression softer now, as if she too could finally breathe. Do you think it could come back?" Kathy hesitated, her gaze drifting to the broken windows, the walls that had once been filled with darkness and fear. The house was still there, still standing, but it no longer had a hold on them. The power it once held was gone. And as Kathy stood there looking at her family, she realized something. The house had never been their enemy. It was the fear, the pain, the darkness inside them that the house had latched onto. But now that darkness was gone. They had confronted it, faced it head on, and they had won. "No," Kathy said, her voice firm. "It can't. Not anymore." George stepped closer, his arm wrapping around Kathy's shoulders. "We're not afraid of it anymore," he said, his voice steady. Kathy nodded, her hand resting against his. "We've faced our worst fear, and we survived." For the first time, Kathy allowed herself to truly believe it. The darkness that had haunted them, the thing that had tried to tear them apart, had no more power over them. It couldn't break them. Not anymore. Missy looked up at her mother and father, her eyes full of quiet wonder. "We're really free." Kathy smiled, the first true smile she had given in what felt like forever. "Yes, sweetheart, we're free. We've made it through." The light from the early morning sun poured through the windows, casting a warm glow over them. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a trap. It felt like the beginning of something new, a new chapter for their family, one that didn't involve running or hiding from the darkness. "We can start over," Kathy said, her voice steady now. "We can leave this place behind. and we'll find peace." George nodded, pulling Missy closer. Together, Kathy took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past finally start to lift, as though the house's grip on them had truly been broken. The fear, the suffocating presence, the endless fight, it was over. They had faced the darkness together, and together, they had conquered it. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Kathy believed it. They were free. They were whole again. The sun shone brightly outside the world, waiting for them. And for the first time, Kathy could see the future stretching out before them, open and full of possibilities. They had survived the nightmare. They had made it through the storm. Together they were free, and nothing could ever take that from them again.